and welcome to Coronomics, Life and Leadership Beyond the Pandemic. Thank you all for joining us from all around the world today, and our best wishes for your health and prosperity. We have a great program ahead with some tremendous speakers, so we want to dive right in. But first, two things. First, on the flow of the event, thanks to your participation in the polls on LinkedIn, we have identified 3 tracks today: globalization, technology, and leadership. We'll begin with lightning talks from our speakers touching on these topics, rolling into discussion with our hosts, and then end each track by opening up for questions. Feel free to contribute your questions and vote on them in the Q&A function. Second, a quick disclaimer. Our guests today are speaking on their own behalf, not as official representatives of their companies. So please keep that in mind when you're posing your questions. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to the founder and CEO of Cambrian Futures. He will be one of our 3 fantastic hosts today, the first of 3 musketeers, Olaf Groth. Kick it off.
All right, thank you very much, Lauren. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I am very impressed and grateful. We have hundreds of participants on this summit webinar now from 47 countries across 5 continents. We are grateful that you are making time. We understand there are many webinars to choose from these days. And we are very glad you chose ours because we have a fantastic program outlined for you. And we're also doing this for a charitable purpose. So you are at once benefiting and doing good, as it were. Our partner, GoFundMe.org, is our chosen charity to which the net proceeds of this event will go. Different funds at GoFundMe.org that are dedicated to fighting the pandemic, as well as helping small businesses survive it. And so you are making that possible. We have 11 speakers that are coming from very different backgrounds, and we have 3 hosts today, and of course a moderator and the production team. I will introduce your other 2 hosts first. That's Mark Esposito and Terence Say, whom you're seeing here as well. 2 esteemed colleagues of mine, professor colleagues of mine, who are also senior members of the Cambrian team, and who are also close friends of mine with whom I love to collaborate, and you will soon find out why. Hopefully, we are able to bring you a very stimulating event with the help of these 11 speakers. You know, at what other point in your week, in your day, in your month for that matter, do you get to talk to a wide array of people? And I'm just going to mention a few, you know, a former, you know, Army Chief of Staff, senior chief economist, in fact, of leading technology firms, a surgeon innovator, and leading lights in competitiveness from India, right? I mean, just to mention the breadth of speakers we have here, not to mention some of the scientists. We also have a parliamentarian from Sweden, right? And I'm not doing everybody justice here, but we will very shortly in the tracks as we introduce everybody with their bios. So an exciting program. Please stay tuned. And with that, I'm going to hand over to my co-hosts, Mark and Terence, for a quick welcome.
Thank you very much, Olaf, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I mean, we are excited beyond belief. We've been working hard to make sure this day could happen, and it's here. The guest that decided to join us in this venture really is what makes this program special. They come from so many different venues of life, and they really make this conversation very, very enriching. To all of you who trusted us on the social media, thank you so much. We know we bombarded you every single day with the opportunity to join us, and to know that you decided to join us is really honored, and you make our work feel a privilege every single moment. So this is a brief welcome also from my side, and I would like now Terence to also share the pleasure of co-hosting. Terence.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, Olaf. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. It is really an honor and pleasure to have you all here, not just our expert panels, but also such a great audience. I'm not going to actually stand in the way because there is so much good stuff coming up. So, Olaf, I'm going to pass it back on to you.
Thank you very much, Terence. I should say, Dan, if you could please bring up the first slide. I believe we're now going to dive in, framing up the topics, as it were. Okay, all right. Here is, again, our speaker slate, as you see, and these esteemed colleagues of ours from all over the world will be introduced to you, like I said, shortly. They are going to help us explore the future. And we are not just going to look at the future broadly, but we're going to be focusing on what matters most to you, and that's discontinuities, tensions, and shocks and shifts. And so in order for us to do that, we have developed a little bit of a framework that we introduced in our webinar about a month and a half ago, and it's called FLP-IT. What does FLP-IT mean? It's an acronym that we designed just to be memorizable and recallable for you. It consists of 5 letters, as you can see: forces, logic, phenomena, impact, and triage. Why would we do that? We were trying to give you a tool with which you can flip your gaze, as it were, from the opportunity that we lost, right, as leaders, as communities, opportunity for growth, and not just for economic and commercial growth, but frankly for human growth, for societal growth, right? We're all more or less growth focused as we try to develop and live our lives and lead rich and satisfying lives. And as such, we have been losing a lot through this crisis. Of course, some segments in society, some groups in society have been losing more than others, and some are more in pain than others. But all of us have been losing a lot and are in a lot of pain. You know, we as leaders then, of course, have a choice. We can choose to dwell on that pain. Of course, we need to acknowledge it. That's what good leaders do. Our leadership panel will talk more about this. But then we need to also lead others into future horizons, and we need to find ways to motivate them to go on that path with us. And that's not easy when people are in so much pain, right? So we've developed this framework to help you think through how you might be able to do that. The first F stands for forces. Here you assess all the different critical uncertainties, the driving forces that are now pushing and pulling on us. Some have been there for a while, others are new. If they've been there for a while, they're getting amplified now. And they're all starting to mesh together into new emerging views and scenarios of the future. And they have their own, what we call operating logics. They have new ways of working, right, as a future, and we call that logic. That's the L. And of course, as that happens, from these logics bubble up new types of phenomena, new types of patterns, as it were, that enable us to understand, you know, what is going to be the impact, and that's the I in FLP-IT, the impact of this new picture, of these new pictures on our societies and our value chains, as it were, our activity chains in our daily lives. And then, of course, we are faced with some choices, and that is to triage opportunity, old opportunity that we may still try to resuscitate and keep alive, but maybe shouldn't, right? Because there's new opportunity arising that we should adjust to and seize. So that's the FLP-IT acronym. And with that, I'm going to hand off to my next colleague here to tell you how we start on this journey together.
Great, thanks so much, Olaf. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So this is actually a scenario matrix. It's done in several instances in strategy to try to determine some form of understanding of the rising of these new logics, that the forces that are currently emerging from a specific period of history are somehow going to create specific scenarios. This is an exercise that we ran back in April. Of course, like every exercise, it's not exhaustive. It's only for the purpose of engaging even more dialogue. And this scenario very likely won't happen the way we envision them, but they are helpful and they're catalysts for us to understand the bookends of given possibilities. You notice that we have also used the geometries of crisis. Every single scenario try to represent a possible evolution, a W shape, a U shape, a bathtub shape, a V shape. Now, clearly, we have noticed that the scenario that we are envisioning could go maybe as a combination or blend about across the 4. What is important to consider is that the pandemic has been, to some extent, one of the major accelerants that we have ever had in history. And this was also very visible when we went through the process of doing the scenario, the future logic ourselves, in which we really could see some form of radicalization, not necessarily just in terms of political ideas, but also in terms of standard of living, in terms of equality or inequality. And the fact that we're looking at scenarios where winners and losers were clearly being redefined, where the role of government was equally being redefined, and where overall the fact of democracy was under siege in many ways. And we'll talk more and more about this because we have speakers that will be able to take us there. So without any further ado, I think the part that matters now the most is really to understand more and more about the discontinuities. And I'd like Terence to take over from this.
Thank you very, very much, Mark. Dan, please, next slide. So, yeah, I don't know about you. I feel like, someone has just pulled the carpet underneath my feet, and then everything in my world just changed. And in many ways, it's actually feel like we're being in a water park. We go down the slide into a pool of water with no way of turning back. And the only case is the only difference is that the water is actually in the murky sea of debt, inequality, fear, and fragmentation. And the new normal is not just a place made up of discontinuities, but also filled with a lot of tensions. And what we're hoping to do today is to actually shed some light in being able to reconcile these tensions. Tensions such as science and politics are now at odds with each other, with many governments choosing politics over science. At the same time, the distinctions between despots and democrats have become blurred. And then there is the regional and the geographical tensions, with the US in retreat, right? How would the world be shaped? A strong or weak Asia is set to tip the balance of power, both soft and hard. At the rate things are going, the haves will have even more than before, and while the have-nots will probably left with very, very little. New arrangements, huge amount of debts, money being pumped into the economies, compounded by technological advancements, can only be a blessing or a curse to inequality. And will we just be seeing social distancings or distancings among the different segments of societies? And where will we be? Killing ourselves with tiring new traveling modes, or getting bored and chained at home, in front of the computer, or we will be enjoying sushi at the restaurant Zuma, or we will be completing our metamorphosis into zombies. With tech coming comes plenty of data, but is it a friend or a foe? But with enough will we have enough safeguards against misuse or determination to create benefits for the society? But despite all of these tensions, we remain hopeful because it lends us opportunities to remobilize our resources, our energy, combined with a refreshed leadership mindset. We should be able to create a stronger and healthier and a more equitably prosperous world. So with this, we like to think that this summit will really mark the beginning of our of such efforts. So I'm going to pass it on back to Olaf, or actually Dan, and we are going to start the Leadership Summit. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Terence, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Let's jump right into this first track, globalization, and start thinking about some of the questions. Everything from the rise of China to the pandemic's disruption of global supply chains, geopolitics, everything in between. We have three great speakers to lead off this discussion. I will provide some brief introductions for all three here, and then we'll let them go with a few lightning talks for you. First up is Nicholas Davis. Nicholas is a professor of practice at the Thunderbird School of Global Management and managing director at Swift Partners, which helps companies harness emerging technologies to create sustainable value. Lake Dai is our second speaker. She's an entrepreneur, a partner at LDV Partners, and an adjunct professor at Carnegie Mellon University. Previously, she spent about 20 years leading product and engineering teams at companies including Apple, Yahoo, Alibaba, and several different tech startups. Amit Kapoor is honorary chairman of the Institute for Competitiveness in India. He's the president of the India Council on Competitiveness and an affiliate faculty member at Harvard Business School's Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness. And Amit will wrap things up for us with the lightning talks. And then we'll go back to some comments and some Q&A. Thanks again to everyone for joining us. Thanks to you, Nicholas, for joining us. And the floor, or the screen, I guess, in this case, is all yours.
Thanks, Dan, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I want to kick off by talking about the global possibilities of a new era that I've spent a lot of time researching and working on, along with Mark and Olaf and others, which we call the Fourth Industrial Revolution, or the 4IR. This is really shorthand for a new period of system building, based on a whole range of exciting new buzzword technologies such as AI or quantum computing, IoT, etc. But all of which take the digital revolution, the third industrial revolution, for granted. Now, just to give the 30-second encapsulation of that numbering, the first industrial revolution gave us the factory, steam power, and a huge step forward in worker productivity. And the second industrial revolution gave us mass production, electricity networks, telecommunications in the form of telephone, the car and the jet engine. It was really the making of the modern world, and on the built environment you still see is the product of that second industrial revolution. And the third industrial revolution is this digital step change that we're all very familiar with. It would not be possible to have this kind of event without those breakthroughs that started with the first general purpose digital computer at the end of the Second World War. But new industrial revolutions really are about step changes in energy, in transport, in communications, and allowing entirely new ways of living to emerge. And it's this on the global scale that's so interesting as one of the forces that Olaf and Mark and Terence, I think, highlighted or could be in their list for the near and medium term outlook for the future. Look, for example, at breakthroughs in neurotechnologies, where artificial intelligence, sensors, and robotics are leading to huge new possibilities in prosthetics and in communication, or the order of magnitude decrease in launch costs that SpaceX achieved by leveraging sensors, on-the-fly programming, and very smart algorithms, which are actually open source, to land their Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy boosters. So what we're seeing is today digital systems are really taken for granted for about half the world's population, and we're building entirely new ways of living, of doing business on top of that, taking advantage of these exciting but still often very nascent emerging technologies. Now, this is the globalization track, and the reason I'm speaking in this track is the primary drivers and implications of the fourth industrial revolution are not about the technology themselves. They're about the way in which individuals and firms leverage ideas and talent from all around the world in an entirely new geography of innovation. And we'll touch on that through the other speakers in this section. And I really commonly get asked the question, so what? What does the fourth industrial revolution mean for me? And one of the first answers I give to that is this is about you looking and thinking and collaborating in a global way, because the old way in which industrial revolutions, technologies, and value systems emerged from a single country at a time, particularly Northern and Western economies, since the first industrial revolution, is no longer true whatsoever. So let me give you 3 reasons to be really optimistic in this new era, and 3 areas to look at in terms of how you can continue to add value on that global stage as businesses and as leaders from other sectors. So the first note of optimism I want to highlight is that innovation is not, for the most part, about deep research and development. It's not R&D. It's about leveraging pre-existing technologies in your organizational model, in your processes, in your stakeholder engagement. And the OECD has done fantastic work looking at non-R&D innovation, which shows that not only that form of innovation is growing about 10 times as fast as R&D innovation, which in many countries is actually going backwards, but it also represents about 75 to 80% of innovation efforts for your average firm. And my second point here is you would be remiss if you kept those efforts within your firm and within your own market, particularly your own country. The second note of optimism I bring is that global collaboration brings innovation. The new geography of innovation means you cannot be only looking within your own borders and nation states for ideas and for talent. And despite appearances, despite the political rhetoric and the disruption to trade that we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years, the world of global collaboration on innovation is moving faster and is tighter together than ever before. It's being intensely accelerated by the pandemic. There are now 159 candidates for the COVID-19 vaccine. Not one of them does not involve at least an international collaborating body or collaborating set of researchers. These are not isolated efforts, and this was set from the very beginning of the pandemic. In January, a team of Chinese and Australian researchers worked together to publish the first genome of the COVID-19 virus, and the genetic map, which then spurred about a quarter of those vaccine efforts, was published freely available in the second week of January. The final note of optimism as I wrap up these comments and pass over to my esteemed colleagues is that the reason why you should look globally at the fourth industrial revolution is because we are genuinely at the beginning of a new era, and living right now at the time where we do puts an incredible burden on us to shape those rules, to shape the logics that will set up those future systems for success in the way that we want to, in a very deliberate way. And living in a globalized world, as the second and third industrial revolutions pulled so many of us together and made us mutually self-reliant, requires us now to really think about what we want the world to look like, and how, in particular, how equitable, inclusive we want to look at that world, and what kind of rules we want to create that. So I want to urge on everyone participating in this webinar and say that this is a tremendously empowering time, because the statements that you make about current events really do shape behavior right now. The policies you adopt within your firms will have a very real impact on your employees. What you decide to keep from the experience of the pandemic and how you decide to respond to current events are really around the world about inclusion, inequality, police brutality. These are not just noticed, but these are shaping the ground floor of the fourth industrial revolution, and are critically important. And just as one example from recently, the IBM's choice to walk away from its facial recognition business is a huge signal in that emerging future. So I want to say thanks to Terence, to Mark, to Olaf, and the team, and to say I am really excited about the global possibilities, the new logics and the new strategies that are available to organizations in the fourth industrial revolution. But I also want to say that it is up to us to make those and shape those, not by necessarily being cutting edge researchers ourselves, but by putting together all the amazing ingredients we have today and create a much more inclusive and equitable era. So thanks everyone, that's all from me, Dan.
Thanks, Nick, much appreciated. Lake, let's turn it over to you, thanks.
All right, thank you. So I'm a venture capitalist, so I'm going to speak on the world of VC and startups. So impact by COVID-19, worldwide VC funding in Q1 this year dropped by 17%, which means 20 billion less compared to 2018 Q4's funding, according to Crunchbase. Startups in travel, hospitality, shared economy, energy have seen their market shrink dramatically overnight. To mitigate the risks, VC firms are more selective, more patient, and more demanding in market validation, which means higher recurring revenue, more POs, and more paid subscriptions are requested. So startups with insufficient funding and limited revenue may have a challenge to raise capital in the near term. So in terms of positive, I think there are positive among the bad news as well. In the last 2 years, we have experienced bullish and optimistic funding to startups. Some will consider hypes. So the adjustment right now will push the founders to be more grounded and focus on creating true value to customers and build efficient business. The most capable startups will survive and thrive and become great companies, like we have seen after the internet bubble and 2008 recession in the US. For early stage VCs, it could be great timing to invest if you have strong conviction, because we're likely to see determined strong founders, less competition, and very reasonable valuation. It's great timing for a corporation to acquire tech startup as well for the same reason. On the other hand, there are more funding activities in a few areas impacted by COVID-19. Number one is online learning and remote work collaboration softwares. COVID-19 may change how we work and study in the long run. Second, cybersecurity, particularly for edge devices and cloud services to support remote collaborations. Social media, online communities, and games for support people during the difficult time. And then online shopping, logistics, and payment services. So we see COVID-19 already created a very strong push to retail brands to convert to online. There are also a number of third-party service platforms catered to SMBs to provide end-to-end online solution. Automation that replace human labor in manufacturing, transportation, warehouses, and more. It's not a new trend, but we'll see acceleration of adoption due to COVID-19. The other trend worth mentioning is VC funding may be expanding geographically, which means VC may be talking to more startups outside the region they live in. Traditionally, VC need to meet founders in person and attend board meetings in person, but now video conference tools support the communication very efficiently and become the new norm. A frequent question that I've been asked lately is what I think of the US-China relationship and how it's going to impact the startup VC community. A decoupling between the US and the Chinese economies has been accelerated since 2018. It pushes both countries towards self-sufficiency. In another word, from globalization to nationalism. China is blocked from investing in deep tech in the US, so they have injected significant resources and capital into semiconductor, 5G, AI, and bioscience. AI application may go rapidly in China with their advantage access to data. We may see blockchain application grow rapidly in China as well, supported by the government. For many US startups, decrease in cross-border collaborations between US and China is not beneficial due to a few reasons. One, lack of funding and M&A from overseas. In 2018, Chinese VC funds invested $14.8 billion in US-based startups. In the first 9 months of 2019, the number was down by 2/3. So where did the capital go? So investment allocations from China to North America now are flowing to Israel, India, Southeast Asia, and creating new opportunity for these regions. US tech startups, in addition, may slow down their market expansion to China, impacted by the obstacles from trade dispute and the COVID-19. In addition, manufacturing costs is likely to be higher if the companies have to find an alternative location other than China. Recruiting high-tech talents between US and China right now, temporarily, we can see a little bit tough because of the constraints. So that being said, although we're experiencing a speed bump, I'm still firmly believe that positive things that will come out of the crisis. My pledge to you is to take advantage of this unique time to enrich, to help, to unite, and to build. Imagine how sheltering in place brought us new perspective of family, relationship, health, career, and even long forgotten passions. I hope after COVID-19 we'll be more humble, more united, more experienced, and use the energy and knowledge accumulated to create a much better world. Thank you.
Thank you, Lei. That's great. I appreciate the pivot to optimism too, is something we've all been stressing lately. Amit, let's go to you. Thanks.
Thanks. So I'll straight off dive into my comments. If you really look at the world today, and I see there are going to be about 5 or 6 big things that are happening and that are going to change the way we look at things. One, I fundamentally believe is that capitalism is changing. Now, the last time when the world was actually hit by a pandemic in 1918 to 1920, there were 26 years of turmoil, which was until the end of the Second World War, the rise of Hitler, and so on and so forth. So we are now really talking about the creation of an absolutely new ecosystem that we should actually look at, which is able to solve the problems of the world. And the problems that we are actually seeing are fundamentally something very, very interesting. You have the huge rise of disparity. And when you talk about disparity, it is not only about economic disparity, it is also about whole sets of disparity in terms of like the digital divide that is actually happening. A lot of people get excited by Zoom and other sets of technologies that are happening. But what we are seeing in countries in Africa or India or Latin America, we are seeing that there is a huge digital divide. People do not have access to the appropriate internet, and students are not able to actually access the information or access lessons. So that is going to create a divide of learning and the ability to learn, and what is going to happen to that generation. There is also going to be huge issues on infrastructure, what happens on infrastructure over a period of time, the financial inclusion, and so on and so forth. And when we talk about capitalism, I see that there is a whole huge effect in terms of the vulnerabilities like humanitarian impact that is happening. The humanitarian impact of this crisis is stupendous, and we have just not been talking about it. The second thing that we are really talking about is what is going to be the credit situation for enterprises, for the countries. I think the fiscal issue for countries are going to be so tremendous that we are actually going to be seeing a whole huge crunch in the world. In fact, we have already noticed that the world has actually slowed down, and we are expecting it to be the worst recession, or probably from my point of view, it is going to be far worse than a depression. The last depression was something like a very, very long period, and we are actually talking about something very, very scary at this point in time. The second thing that we have to be really looking at is the rise of authoritarian leaders. We have been seeing this trend and this whole trend of making our countries great again. We are going to be manufacturing in countries, close our borders, the whole issue of protecting myself from a certain set of sects and all those kind of things. So these sets of aspects are really going to get accentuated across the world. We are seeing that there is going to be a crisis of democracy in many, many ways. In fact, I believe that this crisis of democracy can actually lead to the rise of another antichrist. If I see Hitler as an antichrist, I'm seeing another antichrist coming in the very short period of time. And this is going to be something very, very dangerous that we have to really look at and find answers to. The third thing, in fact, nobody talks about it. I think with the advent of internet and with these sets of crises happening, there is also a huge danger that the world has reached peak IQ. And when I say peak IQ, people are reading less. They are actually believing more of what's at university. They are not reading. In fact, we were doing a survey out here. We found that young people are spending more time looking at Netflix or Prime and all those kind of things rather than reading. And of course, this has got further accentuated with other things that are happening. In fact, when I say peak IQ, people are, the whole idea of intelligence, knowledge is dependent on memory and understanding and assimilating information. Today, information is about 140 characters. It's just become a Twitter world, and there are those issues that we have to really talk about. The fourth thing is about the whole idea of the rise of what I would call as media or the trial by media, the huge power of the social media and things, and there are negatives to it. We simply go out and just massacre people, and we just don't understand the point of view. So this is a whole huge issue that we are actually going to see again that we need to look at. But if you really fundamentally look at how do we really solve this problem, I think we need to solve this problem by looking at a couple of things. Like we have to drop down our assumptions that the world is actually built on. And the assumptions that we are really talking about, I generally look at this whole huge view of the world, that it was actually built on the idea of a dog kingdom or an animalistic kingdom. The idea of capitalism, the idea of belief, the idea of faith, everything is based on animalistic view to the world. Because, there is a certain hierarchy that needs to exist. Everybody is going to be under that hierarchy. All processes are animalistic. We make our assumptions. We start believing in things which are absolutely mundane, stupid, naive, and so on and so forth. And the second thing that we are really seeing is that there is, if you really look at the whole idea of free movement of people, the world was built on free movement of land, labor, capital, and things. And this whole thing is really going to come crashing down. What we are really seeing right now is that this movement is actually stalling in the world. So we need to really see how we solve these problems if we really want to move ahead. But my hope is that people will start questioning things that the world has actually been built on, the institutions that have been built on, and the institutions which are built for control rather than enabling people to be successful and driving change and making their lives better and meaningful. And of course, I hope people will also see that they have to question everything that they've been really talking about and question the whole idea of capitalism, faith per se, religion, and so on and so forth, and start making a difference to the world. Because if we don't do it now, we are going to lose one of the biggest chances this crisis is given to really reinvent ourselves as a race, as humanity. Anyways, we are anyways going to be an extinct race in the next 3,000 years, because if the way the climate change is happening and we are in the middle of a mass extinction, we are going to be dead in the long run. I'm generally happy because the nature is actually going to take its own due course, find a new species, and so on and so forth. Anyways, like humans have been the dumbest of all, if you really look at it, very animalistic, more destruction oriented than anything else. We are very arrogant as a species, and it's time that the species exits. But that's a separate issue, and we can always continue to talk about it. But thanks a lot for this opportunity, and I hope I did not cross my time.
I'm hoping we're not exiting quite yet in any case, but Olaf, let's kick over to you for a little response. We'll do a little quick response yet, and then we'll jump into Q&A.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dan. And most of all, thank you very much, Nicholas, Lake, and Amit. When I'm hearing you talk, I see a couple of different themes arise here, and I'm going to keep it brief and hand it over to my colleagues here quickly. But essentially, it comes down to growth, justice, and governance, right? So what I'm hearing is that there is reason for optimism, because we can see our path to growth opportunities through distributed paradigms in both venturing as well as supply chains. We have to become more agile, decentralizing our supply chains, making them more robust, and therefore spreading growth around. But that really leads me to the second point, which is that in order to get to that growth, we have to de-risk it, right? We have to be realistic. As optimistic as we are, we have to be realistic about the hurdles. And the hurdles today are fundamentally about justice, both ethnic, racial, and economic justice. And that's what I'm hearing as well. We have to cope with that. We cannot simply rely on economics. Today's global populations are perceiving our growth paradigm as inherently unfair and unjust. So we have to look for a new growth paradigm that takes justice into account, which gets me to governance, right? And as much as we're talking about more and more geopolitics leading to more and more fragmentation, we actually have to put our heads together and say, if China in fact decouples from the United States, and if we're now on the path of two potential competing paradigms in this world again, as we've just seen with the G7 announcing its global AI partnership, excluding China, right? Then we have to also say, how will we manage those different governance paradigms that will be emerging from that? Do we in fact have a shot at a more just, growth-oriented, joint global paradigm for governance? And that to me is a key question in all of this. Okay, with that, over to Mark.
Thanks so much, Olaf, for this. And again, also from my side, thanks to Nick, to Lake, and to Amit for having really taken us straight into the conversation on globalization. Maybe a reflection that I would like to share with you as we were talking about this is that we sometimes hear too much about the tension between deglobalization and globalization, like we're dealing with two different problems here. But maybe the truth is somewhere a little bit more in the nuances. We might start having, like in the example that Nick was sharing, a global response through technology in a way which we're redefining the concept of value. And this is really the opportunity that the fourth industrial revolution presents to us, is rethinking about value altogether. We do have, maybe in the example that Lake was bringing up, this idea that we're creating even more distance across country. And that is actually normal, because even the previous model was getting hyper inflated in many different ways, and it was getting untenable. I tend to remind throughout this entire period to either the guests of my webinars or when I'm teaching my classes, that somehow the condition of the world before the pandemic were not in best shape. So the pandemic has simply accelerated the fragility that we already were experiencing before. So maybe what we see, and that's going back into a midpoint, is the reconfiguration of core tenets that are going to define a new narrative. That narrative doesn't have to be in the tension of dichotomy between deglobalization or globalization. It might be something much more hybrid, like most of the events we have seen during the pandemic events that have created this space for some form of integrating structure, although it changed the original paradigm, but it's equally creating something else. So there is optimism that once we move away from this binary way of looking at the world, there might be something more than simply a deglobalization or nationalism and globalization. And it might be the very beginning of redefining those tenets that are going to be really the driving force of the 21st century, something that we were looking forward for so long. Now, like Terrence, maybe to have our final comments before the most exciting part of this for our guests will be to engage with your questions. Terrence.
Thank you very much, Mark. I just want to add one more, one point that has not really been mentioned much, over the, by the three experts, but they all actually, talk about it, and that's capital, the money. Where is the money coming from, and how is the capital actually flow through the societies? Nick was talking about, the globalization, how we can actually collaborate with each other, and there will be innovation, but not just in R&D, but rather in conversations with the stakeholders. Again, that is something that is, that depends on, how the capital is actually sourced. Nick was talking about education, and that reminds me all of a sudden, again, capital, is it going to the right place? Not to mention what, like Amit was saying, that there is a digital divide and there is a problem with financial inclusion. So, from, I guess, coming from the fact that, I teach finance as my bread and butter, I believe the role of capital to be, very, very critical in many ways, defining what the shapes of our future will be like. So, Antonio, I'm going to actually pass it on to you.
Thank you, Terrence. What a great start. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks again for our first speakers and hosts for their provocative and insightful views. A couple of quick notes on how the Q&A process is gonna work. So as you might notice, all attendees are on mute, so please bear with us for that. This is to ensure a smoother experience for everyone and avoid accidental interruptions or noises. So for the ones who are not familiar with Zoom, you can ask questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type your question. If you would like to address a question to a specific speaker, please make sure to include her or his name. And in the Q&A window, you can also see others' questions and upvote the ones you like the most. So enjoy the rest of your summit, and I pass over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Antonio. And again, thanks to my thanks to all the speakers. And let's kick right into some questions here. We're getting a few questions, particularly about the US and China, both as competitors in this new environment, but also questions on how different things on different sides will affect this. So I'll try and wrap it up quickly. What sorts of futures are we heading to if we're getting this sort of bipolar competition, number one? And if there is a decoupling between the US and China, is it just going different ways? How does that affect influence around the world? And what is happening domestically in each that might be affecting that? So that's a whole big set of questions, but maybe if I can kick over first to Nick, give us a sense of how you see the current environment and maybe what sorts of future it's heading toward in terms of recovery from the pandemic.
Thanks, Dan. Look, one useful model that we can look at here is to ask two connected questions. First, is the outcome of the pandemic and the current set of social conversations about equity, violence, engagement, will that lead to a more concentrated, elite-driven decision-making, or will we actually see a shift back away from the direction we've been going into kind of new and renewed forms of democratic and more distributed decision-making? I would say definitely the weight is towards the former rather than the latter. But nevertheless, there is a world where we see the benefits of global public goods and national public goods being more fairly distributed because of changes in policy as a backlash to the last kind of, I'd say the last 15 years of a shift towards more concentrated politics and power in most countries around the world. But then you get a second question, which is if it is more concentrated and it stays concentrated, for whose benefit is that power used? And here, I think on one side, you have the sense that it is indeed kind of oligarchs and elites and people who look like me and sit in positions of power, getting into their 40s and grabbing capital and political influence, and then use that to enrich their own funds and families? Or is it more like the kind of Bernie Sanders type power, where you say we're going to use the kind of what they call a big mother approach in the UK at the moment? We're going to use the value of a more concentrated state power to actually distribute those benefits back towards the public. That leads you to three very different futures. You might call the first one the pyramid, really focused on control at the top state level power. You might call the second one something around the benevolent big mother, and then the third one being the more distributed power, something around the village. I actually see, I don't want to put possibilities or probabilities to that. I just want to say that it's really up to us in the next couple of election cycles, in the West at least, to decide which way that's going to go, and continued political and corporate engagement on these big social topics is really critical in shaping that, as is engagement with macroeconomic policy.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate that. We have another question for Amit. There's a question here, but what are your thoughts on the gift economy as an alternative to the market economy going forward? It's one that's been upvoted here pretty strongly.
Sure. So when you say the gift economy, I think there are going to be issues to that, because when you say an extension of gift economy, you're just giving to people, or there is going to be universal basic income and so on and so forth. I think the larger question is going to be that how do we engage people and how do we actually use their intellect? Because if you're not able to do it, it actually creates disparity, which is far dangerous. Because if you really look at the whole huge world of terrorism, what we see is it's the disparity that leads people to a lot of anger or a lot of violence. So we need to actually do away with that. It's just not going to be about dole. It's not going to be about giving to people. It's all going to be about very clearly engagement, and engagement in pursuits which actually keep their life worth living. We are not going to be talking about a situation wherein we're just roaming on the streets and doing nothing and so on and so forth. This pandemic has actually given us a huge insight that people can't sit inside. There are huge mental health issues that actually emerge out of it. So we need to find a way to engage. You can't engage people on Zoom or whatever in perpetuity. They can't be sitting home. They have to really be physically doing a few set of things. In fact, right now we are in a zoo which is called a lockdown home or whatever. And that needs to be actually taken care of. I hope we are able to find a vaccine and move ahead. But those are the set of issues we need to grapple with.
Olaf, here, a question for you and for Mark, but anyone can weigh in here as well. I guess, how do we redefine value in a way that's equitable? Again, we're looking at equity across a range of things. We're obviously seeing issues here in the US, but globally as well. How can we redefine this in a way that leads toward these better, more optimistic futures that we want to pivot toward?
I'll be happy to jump in here, Dan, and I'm going to hand off to Mark. First of all, though, let me say one more thing on China here, because I do think we got to come back around to that. China is incredibly important in this. I see China becoming much more powerful in the future. They're becoming an innovation powerhouse, and they're spreading that power through the Belt and Road Initiative, which is 103 countries, north of 50% of global GDP. And we do have to engage constructively. I do not believe in this rhetoric around, Cold War 2.0. We have to engage constructively, if for no other reason than the global economy, because right now we're seeing unsustainable debt levels through the Belt and Road Initiative, and that's not healthy for China, for these countries, or for the rest of the world. Coming back to the question, future of growth, honestly, I think we're going to have to bring stakeholders into our business models and into our value chains. We have to take a much more holistic view of how we create value, right? As business people, we need to be less linear in our thinking and design business models and use cases that allow us to co-create with stakeholders and spread the value around. And that's not easy in a world in which too many business people and economists, frankly, have been trained in very linear ways. And we need to become much more holistic about those value propositions. I know that's wickedly complex. We're working on it, but it is not trivial, very difficult, but that's the path to more equity and more justice.
Olaf, maybe I can maybe few seconds of what you said, which I think is important because the question on value. One of the things that I guess you feel is that the way we've been defining value was either by those that were excluded or those that were included, right? And I think we have used this mindset that was also supported a lot by the rise of financialization of the economy to the fact that we're using mathematics and quantification of the economy, because when you're using that methodology, you clearly define exclusivity or inclusivity or inclusion as part of the two drivers. I think in the 21st century, going back to the comment that Amit was making, and also supported by both the financial conversation of Lake and how Nick was looking at the potential ahead of us, we had to move away from this conversation about winners and losers, in which value is defined by who is losing out of who is winning. Also away from this simplistic way of looking at the Pareto relationship that has been going on since the entire time, since my lifetime. I was born by understanding the Pareto ratio of 80 and 20. Now it's becoming even more. So I think really moving away from a value which is measured so narrowly, and how do we redefine the metrics of value, I think is an equally important step that has to happen at the macro level, the meso level, as well as the micro level. So Dan, back to you.
Thank you. Another question that's coming up here, it deals a little bit with startups and the concentration of power in big technology as well. And Lake, this is probably best geared for you with your VC background and your insight there. How do you see this venture capital flows and investment flows, particularly globally, as different countries are supporting responses to COVID or whatever it might be? And what concerns do you have in terms of a concentration of power even further into the big global technology platforms, and the effect that might have going forward?
Okay, so first of all, I think it's a healthy adjustment in general for the investment community. As I mentioned, in the last 2 years, we seen that funding has been very optimistic, and in some extent that I think the criteria of selected company has been compromised in some of the cases. So it is a healthy adjustment, I think, both for the VC and for the startups, because we're forced to go back to the fundamentals to see that what are we truly building, what kind of value we create for customers, and how we can make the business sustainable. So a recent survey in June that 141 VC firms participated, that estimated the valuation will go down as low as 40% discount. I'm more optimistic. I think maybe the adjustment will be somewhere between 20% to 30%. And it is not really across the board. You can see that some of the startups continue to receive more fundings, and others who are lack of fundamentals may suffer. So I think it's really not across the board. And the second is that, as mentioned earlier, we do see that the funding now starts spreading geographically. So how business is done in the past, they have to go through the in-person and regional. I think we might be able to see a new opportunity for globalization and deployment of the capital. The capital is not only coming from large corporations, the funding coming from family offices, endowment, and different resources. And those are a source of funding coming from in different regions globally, regardless. So I do think that we will see some of the upcoming startups in the regions used to be ignored.
Thank you, Lake. We have time for one more question here, and Amit, I'll kick this over to you first. Questions about particularly the digital divide, access to these technologies, which heightens issues here and during the pandemic. But going forward, what roles do leaders and future leaders have to improve the conditions, to bridge this gap and make sure that there's broader, better access to broader and better services?
So I think I would rather see it as an economic aspect rather than a leadership problem. I would rather see that there needs to be an economic solution for this. We need to find models or business models wherein we are able to take services to people at a relatively low price, wherein they get decent level of service for speeds and so on and so forth. Because digital divides are something which are going to have huge impact in the future. As you were really talking about, say, artificial intelligence, or you talk about the field of medicine in the future, you talk about anything, they're effectively going to get impacted through access to information. And if you're not able to do this, like, we are going to be falling apart, or we are going to be falling aside or wayside if countries don't do it. So leaders just need to enable the environment. It's the corporations which will have to find the solutions. And then, of course, the solutions will have to be wherein economic objectives and social objectives come together. It cannot be something wherein disparities increase over a period of time in terms of economic, and then suddenly the social divide is over and the economic divide is higher. We need to find a right balance, or else we are actually going to be talking about a world which is going to be very, very, what I call volatile in the future, because my worry is that the world is actually moving into that direction.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you for that. And thank you, Lake and Nick as well. Really appreciate your contributions here, your thoughts, and looking forward to hearing more as we progress. We'll turn now to focus on technology and the role it will play in both creating and solving some of the tensions and discontinuities that are coming out of the pandemic. We have 5 experts in this track who will weigh in here. And then we'll have a few minutes of commentary after the first 3 speakers, and then we'll go to the last 2. We'll begin with Martin Fleming. Martin is Vice President and Chief Economist at IBM, where he provides macroeconomic insight and analysis to company leaders and select clients. He also leads IBM's data science profession and advises the Federal Reserve Bank of New York on financial technology issues. We have Michael Schwartz, who's the Chief Economist and Corporate Vice President at Microsoft. It's the latest in a series of economics and science leadership roles Michael's had at major high-tech companies, including previous jobs as Chief Economist for Google Cloud, Chief Scientist for Waze, and Head of the Head of the Economics Research Unit at Yahoo. And then Eleni Kitro will join us. Eleni is the Middle East and North Africa Regional Head of Automotive at Facebook, and she helps run the strategic business development for the automotive and automotive as a service units there. She's the MENA culture lead, driving Facebook MENA's team to build a culture of trust, belonging, and of high performance. We'll take a brief break after that, and then we'll follow with Aisha Khalid. Aisha is a board-certified ENT surgeon, chief of division of otolaryngology. I practiced that and still screwed it up here, at Cambridge Health Alliance, clinical director at the Yale School of Medicine's Center for Biomedical Innovation. She also completed an MBA at MIT's Sloan Fellows Program, where she joined the MIT Hacking Medicine to promote disruptive thinking in healthcare. And then Chengyang Xu is an internationally recognized leader and speaker on technology and innovation, especially on artificial intelligence, healthcare technologies, entrepreneurship, and investment. He co-founded the Silicon Valley Future Academy and is a managing partner at PV Med Technologies Limited. He previously worked at CTO as Chief Technology Officer of Siemens Technology to Business. So there's the 5 quick bios. And at this point, I will turn it over to Martin Fleming to kick us off. Martin, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Dan. And also, thanks to Nick Davis for giving the first half of my talk, which allows me to include my remarks in a 5-minute time slot here, and to be able to share with you some of my thinking around where we see the future headed. And in particular, as we think about the 4th industrial revolution, the question I'm interested in is, when will we see the benefits in terms of stronger economic growth and a more equal distribution of income? We find ourselves today in a position where growth has been disappointing, productivity growth has been exceedingly slow, inflation has been low, and income distribution issues remain significant. And to address this problem, let's think back a few years. As we go back to the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, in what we might think of as the third industrial revolution, we saw a period of very strong growth of capital investment, both physical and intellectual capital. This, from an economist's point of view, is represented by Bob Solow's model, where savings was growing rapidly, investable funds were plentiful, and the net growth of the capital stock was quite significant. Of course, years later, Paul Romer came along, talked about spillover effects, the benefit of intellectual capital, and the benefits that they provide. And of course, over this time period, the world, led by the US and the Soviet Union, invested heavily in military technology and space technology, which shared with private sector R&D efforts the growth of intellectual capital. Ultimately, as the Solow model predicted, diminishing returns began to set in, and we've subsequently had a 40-year period of much slower growth in the capital stock, both physical and human capital. And now ultimately we're at a point where we're at a virtual standstill, if not perhaps this year turning negative. We have economists as a profession have no coherent explanation for this slower growth in the net capital stock, but nonetheless, we've seen it happen. And we find ourselves now in the troubling position of entering a new industrial era, but not yet realizing the benefits. But an interesting correlation, if not closer, tighter relationship emerged along the way. As the developed world reached the peak growth of the capital stock, net capital investment, not surprisingly, enormous amount of income began to be generated. And that income, of course, becomes wealth and financial capital, which grew quite significantly, enormously disrupting the distribution of income. And over the period from the about the mid-1980s through to the present, we've seen the top 10% of wealth owners increase their wealth significantly. And of course, in terms of the percentage distribution, lower income households suffered as a result. So this relationship between the very broad trends across the global economy in terms of physical and human capital, the income that it's generated, and the unequal distribution of income is now the very difficult and perplexing policy challenge that the global economy faces. Of course, we saw a quite similar situation in the 1930s and the 1940s, but suddenly a shock occurred. And that shock was the Second World War. Disrupted manufacturing, disrupted economic activities, certainly enormous loss of human life, enormous destruction of physical capital in Japan and Western Europe, a conversion of the entire economic space in the US, with manufacturing firms converting to a wartime footing. In addition, over that time period, of course, we had many young men, and they were largely young men, although there's some women, serving in the military, learning new skills, gaining new skills, new experience, new behaviors, new life, new way of living, subsequently, of course, benefiting from generous government benefits and participating in enormously expanded education programs. And likewise, of course, many women had participated in the labor market and gained a new appreciation for the skills required. So in effect, the stars aligned, forcing, pressuring enormous transformation. There were no firms, there were no industries that by the 1950s went back and returned their organizational practices and procedures and processes to the 1930s. They installed the new equipment, the new capital, the new processes, the new intellectual capital contributing to the enormous period of growth. So it's that forcing and that pressure that then led to the stronger growth in the subsequent decades. So the question for us today is, what is it that will create this pressure? It certainly wasn't the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009. We've seen a subsequent decade of quite disappointing economic performance. And the question is, will the pandemic so disrupt economic activity, so change the way we all live and work, so change the way organizations respond and act, that this disruptive force and this dislocation result in a significant transformation of the global economy and drive stronger growth? I would assert perhaps not in and of itself. There are likely going to be significant policy, political, and social changes as well. Certainly Lake and Amid referenced many of those, and we would expect in the period ahead that we should see continued resistance. In many respects, we see it on the streets today. Resistance to the status quo, resistance to the persistence. Economists use the word hysteresis to think about persistence, but the resistance that's coming to the status quo and driving social, political change that's likely to yield the more equal distribution of income and stronger economic growth. And that, to me, is the place where I am focused very much so today. So Dan, let me take a pause there and turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Much appreciated. Michael, let's turn to you. Michael Schwartz, thank you.
So, a pleasure to be here. It's a really interesting conference. I'm really enjoying the talks, and I'm honored to speak to you here today. And I would like to kind of brighten the moment a little bit. I would like to talk about something good that might come out of those very difficult times. So obviously there are a lot of bad things that are happening right now. There's a lot of human suffering. Not everybody could work from the comfort of their homes. Many people will die. The burden of government debt is going up and up in pretty much every developed country. So there are lots of bad things that are happening. But I also think that there are some really good things that will emerge out of this pandemic that will stay with us forever. And that is positive disruption and adoption of new technologies that would make all of us better in the long run. So let me give a couple of examples of industries that I think are truly troubled industries that I hope will emerge stronger and healthier out of this pandemic. So over time, in every industry, we see, in most industries, we see economic growth and productivity. We see improvements. And we see, as technology becomes available, products are better, products are cheaper. There are some exceptions to this rule. So look at the education industry. It's really a remarkable story of failure over the last half a century. If you look at the cost of higher education, cost of college, in real dollars, it's skyrocketed over the last half a century. And it became enormous burden on families and elsewhere. It's very, very expensive. So now let's do a little, so it's kind of a little bit surprising that the cost of education grew so much because yes, the faculty salaries grew faster than the inflation, but that explains just tiny fraction of the increase in cost. So the cost went up. So what happened with the quality? So let's imagine a little mental experiment, an armchair experiment. Let's imagine that you can send your 18-year-old son to college in the 1970s. He will be attending Harvard, but not Harvard of today, but Harvard of 1970. And he will major in physics. And he will graduate in 4 years, just like everybody else does. How would his college experience of 50 years ago, the quality of the education that people were getting 50 years ago, how does it compare to today? And the answer is, it hadn't improved. It's about the same. So here you have an industry where there is enormous technological change that should make it more productive. We have PowerPoint. We can look things up with a single click. We can easily video record things. Students can view them. Students don't have to spend 3 hours of unproductive time finding that article they're looking for. So it seems like the technology is really helping both students and professors. Yet the cost goes up and the quality doesn't. That seems to violate the most basic axioms of introductory economics. And that's because there's really a lot of bloat, a lot of inefficiency in the education industry that was growing over half a century. And it's an industry really ready for disruption. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to get quality education for everybody at much lower cost, given the new technologies. And I hope that that kind of adoption will start happening right now, because we're in the middle of a gigantic experiment. So suddenly there are literally probably millions of people teaching online in schools and colleges. There are many, many millions of students learning online. And each of those people who are learning and teaching, they're experimenting with new technology. They're learning how to use it. They're discovering new ways of using that technology. And some of those are failures, doesn't work very well, but some of those would be the models that really work. And I hope that would create the future where there would be quality educational offerings that would be much more cost effective. I think it's a realistic hope. So I hope that there would be options for college in the future that would be much more cost effective and high quality, and that wouldn't happen overnight. It wouldn't happen in 2021, but that shift started today big time. And I'm very, very hopeful about it. So the other industry that I don't have time to talk about, but that also traveled on a similar trajectory with education, is healthcare. Again, it's an industry where quality improved significantly over the half a century, but really not significantly enough to justify the cost increases. And for example, the telemedicine is skyrocketing right now. And I think that there are hopefully also positive changes that on the long run come to healthcare because of our experiences with new technologies that were forced by a pandemic. So I'm looking to the future with both a mixture of worry and optimism. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Always appreciate the optimistic view in such a strange time. Eleni, let's move to you. Thanks.
Thank you. And I will touch another part of how technology enables, human beings and the way to connect, closer to each other. And we may all argue that our need to connect socially is very powerful. But how powerful can this be? So we know that different cultures have different beliefs about how important social connection and the way we're interdependent on each other. And I think for me, we're just wired to connect with each one of us. And this desire to connect, this need to connect goes through some major shifts, not only because of the situation we're going through right now, but I think that COVID and the current dynamics that are forming are just, boosting further the pace of these changes. And we see the world changing and shifting through 5 key lenses, which I call them the 5 Cs. It's culture, commerce, communication, connectivity, and community. So let me take each one of those for 45 seconds to try to give you a little bit of an overall idea. So when we talk about culture, we know that diversity and inclusion are a key components of culture with a direct effect on society, on business, on economic growth, on everything. And when we talk about diversity, diversity is about the full spectrum of human differences, visible or not visible. And we talk about gender, age, race, socioeconomic status. When inclusion actually refers to the cultural and environmental feeling of belonging. And it's very important we fulfill on both levels. So from east to west or from south to north, we want to tell, people tell us that some of these factors, some of these characteristics are becoming irrelevant. Gender roles are not so much important anymore. Aging is actually a very old cat notion itself. And we know that from gender equality to millennial productivity, technology is actually opening us to new perspectives and new ways of working. People are rejecting traditional boundaries even more now, and we see all this kind of dynamics coming up and the things happening around us, adopting a more personalized, more complex, and more fluid ways of identifying themselves. And we call these omnicultural identities. When we go into the communication, which is, that's the essence of how we connect with each other, we are moving to a universal language. And this is very much amplified with all the kind of devices and vehicles we're using. So we're moving to the visual language. And most of the content is primarily video. Look at what we're doing right now. And so it's video, and mobile is key in driving the rise of video content. The trend is upwards, is going north. And it's very much driven by faster connectivity wherever it's feasible, of course, cheaper access, or even bigger and high definition screens. And we also see a very high trend in video content, which is not the usual thing that you just have, that you have pre-recorded, you have really curated and you know what to do. But you have live broadcasting. And I think 1 out of 5 videos, even more right now with what's happening, it's live streaming. Because what we're sharing is not just moments, it's real experiences. We're sharing everything, and we give a lot of more context around that. And then we have the more immersive experience, which is AR, VR, or the augmented virtuality. And all these realities have very blurring lines. Nothing is just hard cut off. That's real life, that's not real life. But the most important thing, I guess, we need to understand is that people don't think of all these moments in the terms we use. They're not gonna say, I have an AR moment right now. Oh, no, I have a real-time moment. The people care only about how technology can enhance their lives. And we know very well that technology is only meaningful as long as the problems they solve, the frictions they remove, and the lives they're enhancing are for the benefit of the people. And this is where we say that we move into the world and the era of mixed realities. Leaving this and having that as a foundation of what we're discussing and go into the world of transaction, we're gonna talk a little bit about commerce, the third C. And we live in a world of very high expectations for anything that's around us. Everything needs to be one click, one tap away, one something away, and it needs to be on demand. But the reality doesn't always, meet our expectations. And on all these transactions and the way to commercialize the connection between a brand or people, we always talk about security, and we try to support this and bulletproof any kind of transactions. But also it comes down to the navigation or the user experience, because people are reevaluating the value of time, of their money, and of course of their effort. And all this hits at a new paradigm in which convenience is king and time is money like never before. It's like having a new currency. Another manifestation of people's desire for convenience is having a direct line to the brands or the organizations they're spending their time or they're spending their money with. And we've seen that, and we see that from research as well, that people prefer to message directly than having any kind of other form of interaction because it removes the stress and the friction. And because they're looking for this seamless, speedy, and very personalized experience, which is also touchless. You don't have to touch anyone. And I think this is very relevant right now. And this is where we go into a world of convergent commerce. But all this can happen when you have the connectivity. And when we talk about connectivity, I think we talked a lot already, and we touched on that, is that when we think about the future of the connectivity, we always talk about the Internet of Things. And we know there are more than 20 billion, maybe more, smart objects in the world that their effort is to make our lives more simple. And we all have a mobile device. We cannot live without that. And most of us, we have at least 30 to 35 apps, but we usually spend 80% of our time only on those 3, because these are the ones which are relevant to us. And this is where we see that the mobile device is being redefined, but also it redefines the way that we see it as a device to connect to other areas and to other contexts. But the mobile device is different when it comes to different kinds of markets. In emerging markets, mobile usually means internet. It's very much related. In mature markets, it's more about expanding to include all of the connect objects that will increasingly actually surround and shape our lives. And we come into a world where the center of command is completely mobile, is where we actually manage and do everything. And all this connectivity, actually, it unlocks our 5th shift, which is about the community. And we're gonna talk, I think, about community much more right now, because the dynamics of the community, smaller or bigger, are very strong. So community is very important. And if we go back into history, we'll see that most of our achievements were possible only because we gathered together in communities. And the anatomy of community is very simple. Community can be individual friendships, the people who are right here, right now on this conference, the small group which are built together, supporting an activity online, and it can be massive. We've seen that so many times in the last 5, 10 years, a passion, a cause, or even just a moment. We come together for Christmas, we come together for Ramadan. I live in Dubai, so I can see how people came together to celebrate virtual iftar. And this builds very much on the sense of global citizenship, and is becoming more and more intense, more and more palpable. Our world is more connected than ever, and even if we try to not accept this is what's happening, that even if we see it in our chair right now, we're more connected than before in any way we could think of. And people are more globally engaged than ever. And this is how the modern community is redefining the belonging, where you feel relevant. Modern community emerges in so many different shapes, sizes, places, in a way that resonates online as well as offline. And if I had to sum this up and wrap up, the warm feeling of human connection is very important in maintaining our overall emotional and physical health. But this is transformed very much to social connection empowered by technology. And this specific social connection has the power to deepen the moment we're living through, inspire the change, and build the trust we want in order to come together and act upon what we want. That's
Thanks. Sorry about that. Thanks, Eleni. Really appreciate that, especially the connection where we can get it in odd times like this. We're gonna skip the little break for commentary here to keep moving, and we'll go to Aisha. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for including me, and thank you to Mark and Terrence for this excellent opportunity. So I am very different than the rest of this crowd. I am an ear, nose, and throat. That's the easier way of saying otolaryngology here at Harvard and in Boston. And I want to mention I do a lot of work with early stage startups. So I definitely appreciated the earlier discussions that we had on VC funding. I think that was spot on. My disclosures are that I'm currently helping Apex Ventures and TardyMed. Let me start with the following. So Olaf mentioned a few moments ago that we really have to be constructive. We have to constructively engage and really break away from the silos around our conversations globally, both from an economic standpoint, a healthcare standpoint. And I think that is paramount, and I'll tell you why that relates to my talk. My talk will quickly thought-provoke you in 3 areas. One is, under the broad umbrella of healthcare technology, the first question I'm going to ask you is, who owns your healthcare data? And we'll talk a little bit about how the pandemic has been a force function to really push that to the forefront. The second question I'm going to ask is telemedicine the great equalizer? Will it help reduce the inequality across geography, language barriers, race, all the things that we're seeing right now, even in the news? And the third is, how much are you willing to share? And depending on where you live in the world, you may or may not have as much of a choice. But the reality is we're going to touch a little bit on contact tracing and staying safe during and post this pandemic era. And God forbid, should this happen again, how would we deal with it? But the reason I thought that Olaf's comment was so insightful is that if we're going to talk about the 4th industrial revolution, and we're going to talk about the fact that technology can really help us bend the cost curve in healthcare, I want to highlight something that Fauci, our healthcare physician for the US, who recently has not been allowed to really share as much on the news, he said something about 2 days ago on a news show that really struck me. He said the thing that has been most surprising about this pandemic is not the virus itself. It's not the fact that we have these, as Nick mentioned, like over 150 candidates for the vaccine. The thing that has been most surprising is that it crippled the world within a month or 2. And he really thought that it would take 4 to 5 months to spread globally and really stop the healthcare and economies. And he said within 4 to 6 weeks, it was unbelievable how we all came to a halt. And I think we should really pause. And if we're going to take an optimistic viewpoint, really learn that everything we take for granted can quickly be pulled away. So let me do my part justice. So let me return to my questions. So the first one is, who owns your healthcare data? Whether you live in the US, you live in China, you live in Asia, I will tell you, having visited hospitals globally, interacted with healthcare providers globally, we really have always had this thought that as a physician, I have a very unique relationship with my patient. I want to take care of my patient. And as hospitals have gone to electronic medical record, we want to have your healthcare data. We want to make it available to you and to other providers. But at the end of the day, let me be honest, particularly in the US, but in much of the world, as they've all ramped up, as you've all ramped up to electronic records, there's really always been a thought that health insurers and hospital systems in particular really do feel like we own your healthcare data. And I'll give you an example. If you're a patient in the US and you want to get your records, quote unquote, you have to sign a release, send it somewhere, go to an office in the basement, pick up your records. They're not easily emailed, they're not easily accessible. And for all the startups that have tried in this space, they haven't been able to really break and crack that nugget. Never before, until this COVID-19, have I seen such an openness in our health system and others for patients who, for example, got stranded in other parts of the country or around the world to now be able to access their health records to have a virtual visit with me or other physicians. And suddenly, I think the pandemic has forced the question that the healthcare data, a lot of us firmly believe, should be owned by the patient. And I think the first opportunity, both from a venture standpoint and just a health disparity standpoint, is that if we can really get in the mindset that the patient owns their data and in this global world really travels, that has opened up a wealth of companies, but has also opened up a series of questions around how technology, and I think Martin, I believe earlier, was being kind. Healthcare has been incredibly slow to embrace the technology that is so readily available for banking, Facebook, social media. We really don't communicate online. We don't believe that text messaging is ever secure enough. We never have felt that video conferencing and telehealth was secure enough that I could share and look at your images the way I do now. And yet all of the things that I and others have asked for, patients have asked for, suddenly we seem to be doing. And we seem to be doing it with relative ease and efficiency compared to what we thought. So the first is, who owns your healthcare data? And I want to leave you guys with this thought on this topic. If you feel that your healthcare data is no longer to be owned by institutions, that is extremely disruptive. That means that the physical entity of a hospital system, a brick and mortar building with servers, and even though the data is in the cloud, really having a office of medical records, if that goes away, that changes the way we deliver healthcare. And maybe goes back to the discussion earlier that Martin and others were having around education as well. The second question is telemedicine the great equalizer? So it has again been amazing that from a language standpoint, 50% of the patients that I see here in Boston, and I think globally around the world, often live in a community where their primary language is not the language of the country. So I have many, many patients that don't speak English, and I was always told we couldn't do telehealth or do video visits. It wasn't secure. We were not able to really communicate. And now every single day, even this morning, I pop on a video visit or a telehealth visit, an interpreter gets on as well through a secure line, and we have an interaction with the patient that for most routine things would have saved them a trip, parking, time away from work. I think when this pandemic is over, I want you all to really thoughtfully consider whether it's economic opportunity, market opportunity, companies as they shift and think about this. Most of my patients do not want to return to a world where every single question is in person at a static time point, where they have to sort of remember what symptoms they had 2 months ago when they made the appointment. So I think telemedicine is not only a great equalizer along economic disparity, I think it's going to be really a game changer in terms of geographic disparity. So if you're in a rural area, but you're now able to interact with clinical human beings at the big centers or in the big cities around the world, your access to care may have tremendously grown. And then also a great equalizer in terms of cultural diversity. And by that, I mean, we often forget that if you don't speak the language, then my consenting you for surgery in my native tongue of English and you speak Portuguese, we're not even having a conversation on the same plane. And believe it or not, how silly are we? In other industries outside of healthcare, there's been interpreters and language services for years, and for some reason we haven't utilized it. So that has come along. And then the last one I want to talk about, which I think is going to be really, really interesting and practical, even for everyone who's attending this, it's going to allow you to safely, securely leave your home and travel in the world. I have 3 kids. One is a kid who's home from college, back home from MIT, feeling like, how does she get back on campus? And that is privacy. How much of her data, how much of your data are you willing to share? And again, in some nations, there's no choice, but you take your smartphone, and if you're willing to share where you are at all times, what's that level of comfort to allow for the technologies that will exist? So I can test you for COVID-19, but I certainly can't test you every single day. I think that we will not reach that time point easily for access to most of the world. But what I can do is really start to say, if the world opens up, are you as a human being comfortable sharing where you are, so that if there's an outbreak and there's a color coding system and we want to alert you to come in for testing, can we do that? So I think the discussion around privacy used to be apps using your phone for learning things about you, or sites using your phone to advertise to you. Now I would argue that if I want to dine at a restaurant, go to a movie theater, have my college kiddo get back to school, because believe it or not, she definitely does not feel the social experience of college is the same at home as it is on campus. She has to be willing to share where she is at all times and be willing to keep that contact tracing app on. And it's a contract that the universities are asking people to sign on. But of course, it means that the trust is a social contract for that community to come together. So anywhere you all are, workplaces, homes, family members, universities, hospitals, this is the first time where life and death has been affected when it comes to the privacy of our data. So I'm going to leave you with this thought. Isn't it interesting, myself included, how much more willing I am to give up my data and my location when it can keep me alive? Whereas before, I was the first person to be very much against this. So I know in the interest of time, we'll cover more with questions, but I think the world of privacy and data has changed. And no matter where you live in the world, we're all going to have to really think about that personal decision and think about it on an economic and global scale as well. Thank you.
Yeah, that cost benefit is going to be interesting, especially when you start reaching extremes that the pandemic brings along. Chen Yang, let's swing over to you. Thanks.
So I just want to touch on two topics which I'm very passionate about, which is all about around AI. And the first topic I want to talk about is really about AI and US and China relationship. As several panelists and our host have mentioned, that the US and China relationship is at its worst in the last several decades, and US-China trade war is causing great decoupling already happened in economy, but more worrisome is also causing great decoupling in technology. And so one of the common question is, with US and China leading in the world, in terms of the new AI era, who will lead forward into the future? So my quick take on this is really on the B2C side. I see China has a huge advantage in its population, economic activity data that are already leading in certain areas, and it will surpass US in this decade. But on the B2B side, the China still has many legacy processes and barriers, and US will continue to enjoy its lead for this decade to come. So my biggest worry in this AI and US-China relationship, there are many of them, but the biggest one is what I call the AI scientist exodus. Because if you're looking at in the AI field, this is particularly one area that Chinese-born AI researchers are heavily concentrated. More than half of the Chinese-born AI researchers are living and working in the US. Only 1/3 is in China, and the rest in the rest of the world. And according to a recent study, and one of the most prestigious AI conferences in last year, 1/3 of the publication are published by Chinese-born AI researchers, and most of them are actually in America, working for American companies and universities. With the current targeting and of limiting Chinese-born AI centers in the US to participate advanced AI research, the virus is really we'll see a biggest exodus of AI talents back to China. Something that China government will welcome with very much, because the government has been trying for decades to get talents back to China, and then the US restrict policy and overall negative environment to conduct research here for Chinese-born researchers will cause the exodus in a few short years. So I think this will boost the China AI power even more, and will eventually, I think, will have a big negative impact for the future global competitiveness of America. And so certainly the great discontinuity is ahead. The other topic I want to touch on, which is really consume most of my time, is AI and healthcare, which I actually, just talked about that, very well on the data side. So what I want to comment is really looking at the role of AI. So briefly, if you're looking at in the last 2 decades, AI is not new. In the last 2 decades, we have seen the last generation AI technology has made big impact in 2 areas of healthcare. One is personalized healthcare, and second is precision healthcare. And the new generation AI, with AI computing doubling every 3 months instead of the Moore's law 2 years, we'll see continued rapid exponential advances in these 2 areas. However, I see there are 3 new areas that AI, the new technology, will play a central role to transform the healthcare. And by working, of course, in concert with IoT, 5G, robotics, augmented reality, virtual reality, blockchain, etc. The three areas are, the first one is streamlined healthcare. The second one is distributed healthcare. And the third one is predictive healthcare. In the streamlined healthcare, this is the biggest opportunity in value creation. We have so much inefficiency and waste in the healthcare. I see big step change improvement in outcome, quality, cost, speed, and consistency with the help of AI technologies. And for example, the iFlyTech in China have deployed AI robotic assistant in hospitals that grade patients, answer questions, and direct patients to the right doctors. The second one is distributed healthcare, which is really the home monitoring, telehealth. And according to a study recently from McKinsey, this is a $250 billion industry emerging post-pandemic. Companies like Livongo, Teladoc, they're really transforming these areas. But there are many, many more emerging startups in this space that will shape the future of the distributed healthcare. Very exciting area. The last area is where I personally is most exciting. It's a whole new capability. It's the predictive healthcare. And this is an exciting frontier of healthcare, that the latest AI technology could use massive data from the past and predict critical events alerts for the early intervention. Like the company Waze.ai in San Francisco, they can triage the stroke event prediction using AI and saving lives. So underneath all of these 5 areas, the 2 previous areas which continue going forward, and the 3 is data. That I actually talked about the importance of data. I basically see, here that having a data strategies, solutions that connect people, healthcare providers, healthcare systems will be the big battleground. Once the data is secured, it's all about harnessing AI's end-to-end capabilities for more complex tasks and connecting more healthcare silos and unleashing more values at scale. So in sum, I think we are entering truly a discontinuous world, for good or for worse. A world of mass step changes can happen in short time, whether it's technology forces such as AI, for the healthcare, other industries, as well as the environmental forces, or healthcare forces, like the great pandemic we are experiencing now. So that's the points I want to share. And I want to thank Olaf and Mark and Terence for creating such an opportunity for me to share their opinions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chen Yang. Appreciate that. Terence, let's kick over to you for a little reaction here.
Thank you very, very much, Dan. Thank you so much for all the speakers for sharing their views. It's really like a very, very enlightening. I'm going to keep it short because we have got still like a lots of to come. One thing that I've been hearing is, who are we? I mean, I'm not trying to be philosophical here, by no account. It's just the fact that, like Eleni was saying that, our identities has become very, very fluid. We also heard from Ayesha and Chen Yang, a lot of who we are is now going to be dictated by the availability of data, whether we can actually have access to our own data, or how the companies are actually using our data. If we cannot really actually know or put forward our true identity, how is it possible for the governments to know who the voters are? What people want, what the what people are asking for. Same questions coming from the voters. If identity is very, very fluid, because our relationships with everything is very, very different. How do we know that the politicians, the governments are basically the people who they claim they are? It's fascinating how the fact that we are in many ways because of our ability to connect to each other, we actually end up knowing much less about who ourselves are in the eyes of the others. Olaf, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Terence. I appreciate that. First off, one more time, Martin, Michael, Eleni, Ayesha, and Chen Yang, thank you so much for this tour de force. And, it is at once, exhilarating and frustrating to hear you talk, because I want to have more conversation with you about everything you say. And I'm looking forward to our podcasts in the future. Look, I'm just going to pick up on 3 tensions that I see that are complementary to what Terence was just talking about. The first one I'm seeing is physical versus virtual, okay? And here we have sought to describe it a bit as locally physical and globally virtual. What is that new balance between the physical and the virtual? You know, we heard Michael talk about, you know, the future of education. Obviously, for Mark, Terrence, and me, that's very close to our hearts. And I'll be the first one to say that that environment, that education environment, that system needs some very, very drastic innovation. And we're also hearing from students that, frankly, they like the physical classroom experience. They want to be physical in the room with each other. And so how do we ensure that they're getting cheaper or less expensive, I should say, less costly, more equitable education, while also understanding what education really is? Is it really just a content download, or is it life experience? And that's a community element. And so so that balance of virtual versus physical, I think, strikes all of us, right? No matter what our field is, but certainly education. And also, as we heard from Ayesha, in healthcare. The second tension is, you know, this whole thing around community, accessibility, inclusiveness. Let us not forget that as much as we see opportunity in this new digital world, post-COVID-19, 3.7 billion people around the world do not have digital access. That's half of the world's population. That's insane, right? Think about that. And what are we going to do with them? What can we do to make this world more inclusive as we are building the digital nervous system of the world that Nicholas and others were eloquently talking about, bringing the humans, and there was a great Q&A chat here as well, bringing the humans into that digital nervous system. We have to make sure that 3.7 billion people are included in that. How do we do that? And then the last one is, and I think Terrence already hit on it as well, the tension between, you know, on one hand, the incredible value, Ayesha talked about this as well, right? The incredible value we have in sort of predictive technologies. I mean, Shenyang and I do work in this area as well. Predictive technologies like AI, and the value of that for human health, human development, human growth, societal safety, right? Clearly, on one hand, and on the other hand, surveillance or monitoring, or choose whichever term you like. And I think Ayesha is right, that we are finding a new balance here personally, as we are trying to be kept safer and healthier, and we have to give up some data. That's an uncomfortable tension, but we have to navigate it. There is no evolution without data. And so how do we do that? Keeping surveillance in check, governing it, regulating it, making sure it's ethical, and harnessing these new growth horizons. So those are the three tensions that I see, the three discontinuities and shifts. Yeah. All right. Dan, I think it's back over to you. No, actually, it's Mark. Mark, my friend.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Nicola. Terrence and Olive has already gone deep into a commentary. I'll try to maybe provide with some final food for thought in the conversation that we heard. I think we're hearing about redefining human values in a way that were actually lost and dispersed in the previous models. The fact that we're rethinking about what being a human is through this entire period of history is something that we have to consider as a silver lining, especially now that many conversations or many questions are becoming open question again. In the Q&A, there were a question about some of the current events in the United States. It looks like that if we're not able to address some of these challenges right now, this challenge will come back and it will create the erosion that somehow the West is experiencing. And it goes back to one of the scenarios that we had at the very beginning through the logic, the fact that the erosion is somehow eroding the Western heritage, and another group of countries that are driven by an entirely different set of imperatives are somehow surging, so to say. So again, my worry is when we're hearing the conversation is not too much about just the potential, because really what we want to do in this summit is also to focus on the asymmetries that we keep on seeing happening more and more. And I think across the 5 speakers of this session, we notice the opportunities are there, but we also notice an increase in some form of bipolarism happening more and more. And what you just mentioned now, Olive, about the 3.7 billion is absolutely something that sometimes we don't really consider about. But it's true that from cloud computing to the technologies, they are in the hands of the fourth industrial revolution model, credo, or way forward. If we're not careful at understanding that technology only works if it's going to be diffused and distributed, we're going to make the most unjust form of predeterminism by making the gap between those who have, those who don't really have, even wider. And this is really where technology can really help us to reverse the trend. Because we're asking ourselves this question, I think we can also ask, what is the governance technology require for us to really integrate and reconcile differences rather than exacerbating them and making it even wider. So thanks for, again, for my behalf as well, to the 5 speakers. You have given us more than lightning talks, right? It was lightning talks X 100 for each one of you. Dan, back to you now.
Thanks, Mark. Just a quick note on the Q&A. We're getting a lot of great questions here in the Q&A function on Zoom. Our speakers, and Mark, Olaf, and Terrence, will be trying to answer some of those throughout here within the chat function itself, or within the Q&A function itself. And I'll pull a couple out here quick. One that seems to cut across, we're talking a lot about education and healthcare in particular here, and one that's cutting across that is, who's going to be driving these changes? Is this something that government's driving? Is this something that the private sector is driving? Is it the consumer? As we're seeing these changes, as we're hopefully, you know, technology is starting to improve care and control costs and bring those curves better aligned. You know, what's driving that? Maybe I'll kick that to Michael and then Martin first for, you know, a look generally, and then we can look at the education and healthcare. Aisha and Chen Yang, if you want to weigh in there a little bit too. Sorry, Michael, can you start us there with that?
Oh, hello? Yes, sorry about that.
Gotcha, no problem.
Yep. Sorry, what was the question? I apologize.
No problem. They're trying to get a sense here for who might drive, what might drive that bringing together the sort of cost and quality curves that you talked about a little bit for education, for example, but also for healthcare. Is it government initiative, or is it private sector, the consumer? What will drive that if we do see that?
So that's a great question. So I think what's really driving it today is the pandemic. So let me give you one data point. So we did a survey of I think 1,000 American families. And we found out that the rate of usage of online learning tools is at all-time high. It's skyrocketed. And what's interesting is that 90% of people, 90, are reporting that those tools that they're finding online are meeting or exceeding their expectations. So what's already out there is better than what people expected to see. So tools are already there. There are lots of online learning resources. There are all kinds of things. All those things have big difficulties with consumer adoptions. So now those things are being adopted. Now you have an army of probably close to 1 million teachers and educators worldwide who are trying to teach online. They're taking existing tools and they're experimenting with them. They're learning how to use them. They're becoming more comfortable with them. The students are becoming more comfortable with them. So out of that, I expect that the private sector, I don't expect it to come from the government, because I think that those kinds of, governments, I think, are great in doing like great projects, like, putting a man on the moon, where the objective is clear and it's just a massive technical problem. Governments are great at that, big centralized projects. Here it's something very different. It's about little tweaks in the way people interact with already existing technology. We don't need any kind of technological revolution in education in terms of anything like a Manhattan Project. What we need is to take existing tools, learn to use them better, figure out how to use them, and tweak them a little bit. It's not a big expensive thing, it's just being responsive to the user. So this is something that private companies are best at. So that's my hope. I do think it would come from like grassroots, from learning from better experiences, and from experimentation that's happening right now, and that will bear fruit in the decades to come.
Thanks, Michael. Martin, let me flip that same question over to you a little bit, and maybe in terms of what you talked about, in terms of when we'll see the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution here.
So I've learned in my economic forecasting career never to give both an outcome and a date in the same forecast.
Fair enough.
But seriously, I would agree with Michael's point that the pandemic is being very, very disruptive. There's no question about it. And the question that I am looking at is what will cause the social and political change necessary to drive the economic outcomes. I'm obliged as an economist to say economic policy matters, and it does, but it's more than that. It's the organizational change, it's the political change necessary to reduce the degree of resistance to the status quo to enter the new era in the Industrial Revolution. And that still remains to be seen if the forces now are great enough to drive that massive global change that we're talking about, and to see the kind of distribution of benefits. But it's, I would assert, much more of a political and a social issue, which the protests and street demonstrations that we've seen, while related to bigotry and racial issues, certainly are also reflective of many of the same social pressures and are likely contributing to much deeper change in the period ahead. So Dan, let me turn it back to you.
Thanks, Martin. Same sort of question coming over to you then as well. How do you see, again, does government drive change in healthcare, or is it the patient, the providers? I guess, how do you see this, particularly, coming out of the pandemic?
So I almost felt like you set up the question for me, because for years we've been teaching at some health ventures classes that technology has the ability to bend the cost curve in healthcare. But now I think, in answer to your question, what is going to drive healthcare's change is going to be the market. And what I mean by that is, if we think about the government as a major payer and insurer and provider, at least in the US of healthcare and also in many countries, the satisfaction of the care that you receive as a patient and the satisfaction that you feel that you're able to give care as a provider have become the huge drivers. Very practical example, because we always say healthcare is local. In the city of Boston, like a lot of big American cities, despite inequalities of access, you have a lot of choice. And the person that you're going to go see to have your surgery is someone who's going to be accessible, who's going to be available, if not in person right now, then via telehealth, and that you are going to be able to get your questions answered. And if as a patient, you don't feel comfortable, you won't come to that hospital and or that doctor for surgery, which frankly will lead to a loss of revenue, which makes hospitals and health systems very nervous. So as patients are choosing with their feet, and in a lot of the rest of the world with two-tiered health systems choosing with the dollars they're paying, you want to keep your patients and keep them engaged. So I think the driver is the return of healthcare and the satisfaction of healthcare. And then the last thing I'll add is, that is being accelerated by one other point that you all have been talking about in the education sphere. As much as I'm touting that it's wonderful to be able to get to know the patients and do much of the pre-work online, I always have an easier time having a difficult conversation with a human being that I've actually physically met before. So an established patient, just like to me, an established student, is a very different relationship than if I meet you, Dan, for the first time, and I tell you over video you're having a surgery that can cause blindness or eye damage, and I'm taking this tumor out. Don't worry about it. We'll meet each other, the 20 minutes before the surgery. That's the part where the blended in-person virtual has to come into play. So I think that will also be interesting for both spheres.
Makes sense. Chen Yang, that's sort of an interesting segue to you and maybe the role AI plays in this as well. And whether it's guiding physicians or patients, but also maybe more immersive experiences there too. But I don't think it replaces that interaction. But how do you see AI playing in, not just there, but in healthcare in terms of driving some of these changes?
Yeah, I think this question should be linked to also the government and the private sectors. And pre-pandemic, I really believe in US, private sector is really the forces driving the changes forward, with government, of course, and helping to get out of the way, and so the innovators can drive the change. But I think with the pandemic, my view also is shifting, because if you see when the policy was shifted, allow the HIPAA compliant, to be more open up to telehealth, and all the insurance code open up, is suddenly creating explosive adoption of telehealth and video visits, and because of the pandemic. And so you do see the immense power of market creation of both in terms of government, insurance, and in terms of adopting new technologies. And on the other side, obviously, we have to be careful because healthcare is really about the life of people, the safety, and whether the new solution will really bring the outcome needed. So we do need these to be validated. So I think that driving a balance forward, the government, and then the market creation forces like insurance company will play a huge role forward. So that's really my take on. But with pandemic also, I think it's a transcending force of beyond government and the private sector, beyond anybody. And so I do think the pandemic will push us to rethink about assumptions we have taken for the last decades. What have gotten us here is not going to be enough to get us to the future. And so we do need to, as a collective society, re-examine the assumptions and really looking how we want to reset and rebuild the healthcare system forward that is more efficient, less waste, and really carrying the patient the best. And I think that's a great opportunity ahead. And AI will play a central role for the decades to come.
Thank you, Chen-Yung. And I want to sneak one more question here for the technology track. Eleni, we had a few questions come in about sort of, political identity and human identity online, but also I think I'll tie it into how you were talking about communities. We're seeing that importance of communities, and whether it's online, in person, or conferences like this, against sort of another trend with increasing nationalism, for example, and fracturing in society and that sort of thing. How do you see those two forces sort of interplaying, particularly coming out of the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a very interesting but very difficult question to answer it, in one way, because the need of people to connect is there. People are born with this need. On the other side, whether you like someone or not, it's something that you grow. It's something that you grow as a feature in you. But we see that people, they, at least, at a big proportion, they don't want to see into this kind of the gender, the race, the age, the origin, where you come from or you live, and they don't care about that. They care more about what is the cause you're believing in, what is the values you have. And this actually brings together big amounts of and big numbers of people from all over the world, just because they have the same goal. So we will all have people going to be more into, looking into very territorial and very nationalization, but there are also a lot of people who want to be, global citizens and connect with others who they think alike. I don't know who's going to win over who. I hope that the whole situation right now will help us, and of course with the support of governments, of organizations, of even conversations like this, to make people open up their minds and understand that the benefit of coexistence is not in keeping ourselves, in the small territory we are, but open up and just connect, always safely, and support the same cause we want. I don't know if this answers the question, which is a very difficult one to make it black or white.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks, Eleni. Olaf, you had a note.
Yeah, so, I want to pick up on something that's really becoming a thread here, but it's not really being called out. Well, I guess it's being called out by some of our thought leaders. Chen-Yung just mentioned the government, right? I see Kari Guittard, one of our rapporteurs and ambassadors here in the thread, also saying we have to find ways to re-educate policymakers, right? and a number of you have sort of touched on government. We need to emphasize one thing. Government needs to get this right, and we need government. You know, the era where we as innovators could just say, let's ignore government and just move fast and break things, I think is once and for all over, and we do need new modes of engagement with government. Government may not have the right technology expertise, you know, Silicon Valley or Shenzhen style just yet, but then we're going to have to collaborate to create that capacity. Government does, however, have a lot of long-term action and strategic capabilities in shaping environments. You know, whether you're looking at U.S. or European governments or the Chinese government, I think the role of the government is very preeminent, and we do need to make sure that we get that right in a healthy way. So I just wanted to call that out because that also now creates a bit of a bridge into the next panel.
Yeah, let's turn to that last track here, leadership. First of all, thanks to all the speakers for the technology track. Again, great stuff there. And we'll turn here to the leadership track. You know, the pandemic poses plenty of challenges and problems, but it's also given us an opportunity to reshape a more equitable and sustainable future. But we need some sort of transformational leadership to push us there. And fortunately, we have some exceptional leaders to give us some guidance here. General George Casey Jr. served 41 years in the U.S. Army, including as Chief of Staff for 4 years and as Commander of the multinational force in Iraq. General Casey is a widely respected authority and lecturer on strategic leadership, including at Cornell University, the University of Virginia, and a host of other colleges and organizations. Aaron Conatin is president of Conatin Strategies, which advises companies that seek to do business with the U.S. government. During the Obama administration, Aaron was Undersecretary of the Air Force and Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. She previously served on the staff of the House Armed Services Committee. And then we have Helena Antoni, who's serving as a member of Parliament and has been there since July 2019, representing the Liberal Conservative Party Moderaterna. She's on the committees of infrastructure and enterprise, and she has a focus on climate policy. So we'll hear from these speakers here on leadership, and then again, a little Q&A toward the end. General Casey, thanks again for joining us, and I'll turn the forum to you.
Great, Dan. Thanks very much. Hi. Hello, everybody. As Dan mentioned, I've been teaching leadership at the S.G. Johnson College of Business here for about the last 6 years. So I'm sharing the lessons that I learned the hard way with the next generation of business leaders. The subject of my class is called Core Leadership Skills for a VUCA World: Volatile, Uncertain, Complex, and ambiguous. And that is certainly the world that we are living and leading in today. And as I've been watching the leaders at every level wrestling with the challenges presented by the coronavirus, it strikes me that much like the VUCA world I talk about, this environment combines to impede a leader's ability to understand the environment, to decide what course of action that the organization should follow, to communicate that decision effectively, and ultimately to act decisively. And the leaders who seem to be most effective today are the ones who are envisioning the future and acting. So for me, the question becomes, how can you as a leader act effectively in the swirl of today's events? How can you get your arms around the issues facing you and your organization to the point where you're not only comfortable acting, but driving that action forward to success? So here's how I think about it. First, it might seem odd, but succeeding today starts with humility. We all have to accept the fact that we're human. We can't read people's minds. We can't predict the future. And there's always something that we can't know. So when we make decisions, because of that, the best we're going to do is something that might work. In fact, in the military, we say there are only two kinds of plans: those that might work and those that won't work. And because we're human, the best we're going to do is a plan that might work. We have to accept that. Second, I'm reminded of a quote by Sun Tzu that says, enlightened leaders make decisions with a clear mind and a pure heart. And when I was confronted with really difficult decisions, I tried to make my decisions with a clear mind. I dove deeply into the problem. I collected all the information that was available from as many different sources as possible about my organization's status, about my competition, and about my external environment, those things outside of my control that could impact me or my organization. I did my homework. I had to feel comfortable that I had given the problem my best. I had to feel comfortable that I was deciding with a clear mind. Then I had to be able to look myself in the mirror and say, I'm doing this, I'm making this decision for the right reason, that I was making this decision with a pure heart. And if I believed I was making a decision with a clear mind and a pure heart, that gave me the conviction that the plan might work. And that gave me the courage to act in the swirl of my VUCA environment. Thirdly, there's another military axiom that goes back to the great Prussian General Helmut von Moltke. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. Think about it. If the best you're going to do is a plan that might work, and there are so many external factors over which you have no control that are bombarding you every day, the chances of things going exactly as planned are decidedly remote, if not infinitesimal. That's why that at the same time as I was vigorously driving execution, I was constantly asking questions like, are we doing what we said we were going to do? Are we still doing the right things? What's our competition up to? And I was constantly looking outside the organization and into the future to identify both challenges and opportunities. Because I found if I just looked for challenges, I got defensive and was less likely to act decisively. So for me, it's the leader's job to prepare the organization for success in the future. And you can't do that in our VUCA world unless you're continuously assessing and adapting. Finally, I needed to communicate to my stakeholders in a way that enabled them to imagine and act on the future that I envisioned. People today want to know what's going on and where they're headed. They also want straight talk, especially in a crisis, even though they might not like what they hear at the same time. So I found candor very important in my communications. I needed to be clear about the risks, and I needed to be clear about what I didn't know and what I actually couldn't know. And then I needed to tailor my message to the various stakeholders that I was communicating with. I found it very important to let people know how what they were doing was contributing to our overall success and to do it frequently. So, accept your humanity, make your decisions with a clear mind and a pure heart, continuously assess and adapt, and communicate with candor, empathy, and frequency. And you can impose your will on this VUCA world and succeed where others don't. Thanks.
Thank you, General. Thank you. Erin, over to you.
Thanks to Dan, and it's always a pleasure to follow General Casey. I feel like I've done it a lot in my career. So given that even if you read my bio, and even if you're American, you probably don't understand exactly what it is that I did for a lot of it. So building off the end of the last discussion, for the first 10 years of my career, I was one of those educators of government. I was on what they call the professional staff of a committee in Congress, which meant that I was bringing my expertise on international relations and defense policy to members of Congress and trying to help them as they made both budgetary and policy decisions in considering the budget that General Casey and his partners at the Defense Department sent to Congress for its consideration. And then also as Congress had hearings in their oversight capacity, looking at the roles and missions, the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and other things that, that the Department of Defense was doing. So I was one of those educators, if you will, and one of the people who helped members of Congress make good decisions. And I'll be very interested in Helena's comments as to how many things translate over on the European side of the ocean. And it's also really what I'm doing now in my private sector capacity. I'm helping companies, most of them technology companies, who have not done business with the government before, not all in the defense space, a lot of them with commercial technologies, and many of them now in the healthcare space, who want to help the United States government understand what they're doing, what the government should understand in light of the pandemic or in light of shrinking federal resources, about what the government could do better with less money, taking advantage of what technology is out there. So I'm not at all advertising my services, but I'd be more than happy to talk offline with folks who are trying to get a discussion going about how we better educate not only the United States government, but governments more generally, because I certainly agree with the discussion that Olaf kind of was touching on, and that the panelists of the last panel got going. I thought I would touch in a little bit more depth on the planning aspect of what General Casey was talking about, because in all of my jobs, whether it was in Congress, in looking at budgets from the Defense Department and their plans, what we were looking at is, did the way that the department wanted to spend their money and the programs that they wanted to execute, did it align with the strategic priorities of the United States? And then when I went over to the department, and I was one of the senior defense leaders who was coming up with the programs and coming up with the budgets, it was the same thing. How do we ensure that of all these very worthy programs, we are putting at the top of the list those things that are most crucial to executing the strategic goals of, in this case, the President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, and the strategic vision that they've laid out. So all of you, regardless of your organization, public sector, private, or even the students who are out there, you all have strategic goals. You all have things that you're trying to accomplish. And so whether you write it down in the form of a strategic plan or not, there are all things that you're trying to accomplish. And most of you out there have external stakeholders that you have to respond to in some form or another. So for some of the technology companies, it's your funders, venture capitalists. Many organizations have boards of directors, whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit organization. And for those of us in government, it's the Congress or the parliaments in our countries, and ultimately the people that elected those representatives. And so the ultimate rule of planning is that resources should be aligned with strategic goals. I can tell you from being in the US Congress, that is not always the case, but that is what should happen. So my advice, to every leader is to try to ensure that that happens. And you all know that better, as well as any of us, the disruptions that the virus has had, regardless of the type of organization that you have. And if you're a global organization, it's worse in that different parts of countries, different parts of the world have been hit at different times with different intensities. travel has been disrupted, supply chains have been disrupted, social distancing has created challenges inside workplaces. But I think that there are also ways of looking at this that can create opportunities, and that's certainly a theme that's been hit upon by many of the other speakers here. But I'll just give an example from the Department of Defense, which, as you all know, is a massive organization. And the United States economy, like many Western economies, has taken a hit, and there will be fewer tax resources coming into the government. And because of that, the Department of Defense, like many organizations, is going to have to make hard decisions about resources. And that will require a decision about which programs and which resources, both in terms of people and money, best align with strategic goals. You add on top of that the fact that there's a presidential election in November that may or may not change the presidential leadership, and you have another set of tumult into the system. So the thing that I would say is, for all of you, it is better to do a proactive look at your strategic planning and to look for opportunities within that. And to say, you know, are there innovative things that you've wanted to do in the past that you haven't been able to because you couldn't get traction on it, but this creates an opportunity to do it? Are there new partners out there that perhaps weren't available before, but this creates an opportunity to do it? And can you push new technologies forward because all of a sudden people are looking for a new thing to fix a new problem? I'm seeing all of those opportunities in the work that I'm doing right now. And I think to look at this not only as problems to be solved, but opportunities to be captured is a great way of dealing with this planning to execution issue. But I would really encourage this being a proactive way of getting after it rather than being letting it happen to you. I couldn't agree more with General Casey that no plan, you know, survives first contact with the enemy. So it's got to be an ongoing effort. But proactive planning, in my view, is the best. And then just on a final note, because my last job at the Pentagon dealt with the people side of the house, and you all have touched upon it, I think focusing on the people in your organization is absolutely as important as focusing on the money and the technology and whatever else your product is that you're bringing forward or your programs are that you're bringing forward. And, you know, there's not a part of the world or a part of industry that's not impacted by kind of the human stress that the last, you know, 6 months, depending on what part of the world you're in, has brought upon us. So I think it's incumbent on all of us as leaders to remain focused on the human as well as the fiscal portion of that. And with that, I'll leave it to Helena. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Aaron. And Helena, all yours.
There we go. Thank you very much. And thank you for hosting this summit. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on the future of leadership. I know I only have 5 minutes, but just planning for this was very hard to cram it into 5 minutes. So I'll just get started by talking a little bit about millennials and Gen Z. These are two generations that truly believe that they can change the world, however, only on their own terms. Inclusiveness, individuality, ownership of one's work, freedom, flexibility, all these things have been the leading thought on the future of leadership for many years now, but have yet to be widely implemented. This type of flat organization is quite common in Sweden, and sometimes even to the point where no one is in charge. And preparing for this summit, I decided to interview a number of young female leaders in my network. And as one of them put it, even the nobodies in the company feel that they have the right to contact the CEO to offer advice or to complain about something. So this both has positives and negatives to it, of course. But it really got me wondering about hard and soft leadership and what value each type brings to the table. Hard leadership is what we've been taught to value as good leadership for generations now, and yet every time we actually sit down to discuss leadership, we seem to think that the opposite is the best. And in politics, we're seeing a shift from traditional forms of political involvement to more activism for individual causes. Younger generations are less interested in structured political work and more interested in working for one specific cause. For example, Fridays for Future and Black Lives Matter are two enormous movements that I believe have seen a surge much thanks to this new age of activism. Political issues that have otherwise been largely ignored are now being forced onto the political table by these young activists. And they're also driving their parents and their grandparents and everyone around them. So this shift has been happening since the 80s, so it's really nothing new, but I believe it serves as the perfect example of where we have been and where we are heading. Many businesses have really been put to the test throughout this crisis. It has forced otherwise unwilling leaders into digital maturity and has created a whole new business structure. And I don't think that anyone is going to go out of this crisis and think that I really miss my daily 45-minute commute through heavy traffic. I just don't really think that that's going to be a reality for many people. So some companies are even discussing if they really need a physical workspace. And that is really something that is going to change the discussion on leadership. How do you lead a team when you can't look them in the eye? And how do you lead a country from your kitchen table? I believe the discussion on leadership has been stuck for quite some time because it hasn't really been put to the test in a while. This crisis is not only putting a strain on leadership in the traditional sense as a financial crisis or a war does, it's also changing the foundation on which we expect to work and live. So instead of asking the question, may I work from home, people are going to start asking the question, why can't I work from home? A crisis often means a higher demand for stronger and tougher leadership, but this one is also demanding flexibility and individuality. It's made us realize what works for me individually. So some people have realized that they really enjoy working from home, and others have realized how important the office actually was for their productivity. So coming out of this pandemic, I believe we will know much more clearly what exactly it is we need from leadership. And I think we're going to be much more unwavering in actually demanding that leadership. Freedom leads to greater productivity. This is something that we've seen during this crisis. It leads to more integrated systems, and it shows us that more gray areas are actually good. And going forward, I think we're going to be seeing a much more diverse group of leaders that offer a bunch of different approaches and mindsets. So the hard and soft leadership styles don't really go against each other. They're both valuable, but in different contexts. So maybe this crisis actually means that we start evaluating which type of leadership is appropriate in which situation. So as I previously mentioned, in the beginning of a crisis, there's always a high demand for the hard leadership. But going out of a crisis, people are longing to go back to something close to normal. And I believe this is, I believe it means that we're going to start talking about those values that we brought into this pandemic of flexibility, individuality, and inclusiveness more than ever. So I believe my 5 minutes are up there. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Linda, thank you. Very much appreciated that perspective. Olaf, let me turn to you for a little commentary, and then we'll jump to some, and then Mark and Terrence, and we'll jump to some Q&A.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, panelists. I mean, again, inspiring, and there was so much here as I've been taking copious notes. Again, let me hone in on some tensions, and I will say right up front, it is just not possible to do everything you said justice. But I heard, George talk about, as a leader having to wrap your arms around the future and yet not falling into the trap of wanting to forecast, right? So how do you exercise foresight and not forecasting? And there is a fundamental difference there. We tried to give you a little bit of a tool with the FLP-IT framework, but that is one thing to keep an eye on, because forecasting could tie you into an official future, quote unquote, that just will not happen because it's tied to your biases and to what you have lost. So that's tension number one. He also mentioned authenticity, and at the same time, of course, being motivational. How do you do that when you're looking at a, pardon the word, shitstorm out there of chaos and pain? You need to acknowledge that and also give people a reason, a motivational reason to follow you on a path that, as he said, is uncertain, right? A path that might lead to success, but is not guaranteed to lead to success. And so that's yet another tension for leaders to navigate. And then, we heard Aaron talk about many important things, but one of them was the emphasis on planning and people at the same time, right? So oftentimes when we as strategic planners get so caught up in the intellectual exercise and then, corralling and motivating and selling to stakeholders to make the plan, put the plan in place, we forget, of course, as she rightly points out, that at the end of the day, this is about people as much as it is about anything else. And having taught organizational development a bit, and I heard Helena also touch on leadership styles. The tension is between that visionary and planning skill as a leader, and on the other hand, the more coaching-oriented and empathy-oriented style of leadership, and the ability to toggle back and forth between those two. And as you know, there are many more leadership styles than those two. And then finally, also Helena talking about flat organizations and harnessing the power of the edge, as we say, the edge of the organization. How do you act fast, which would, lead us to believe that centralization is the way to go? We always talk about China and Beijing's power, being, leading to a lot more speed. And how do you balance that and also harnessing the power of the edge, distributing, being flatter, being more inclusive? And here I would also say, let me put in a plug for our female audience and our female speakers and any female around the world. I do believe this is the moment in time when we have to leverage many more female skills that are very clearly very suitable to this world of chaos. And I will leave it at that because that's another topic altogether. But we ought to take that up somewhere in our discourse. Finally, political structures, Helena mentioned political structures or structured political work versus issue work, and that this new generation is much more issue focused. How in the world are we going to deal with that when everybody has their, of course, rightful slate of issues, and we also need to keep political structures and processes in place? We are so preoccupied with, certainly here in the United States, maintaining the integrity of political structures and processes, and yet the future generation is drifting toward an issues environment for which the existing political structures and processes just aren't that suitable, right? And so there is another tension there and another pressure point that the crisis is inducing, right? Okay, over to Mark or Terrence.
Yes, thanks, Ola, for this. And again, in the spirit of brevity, I really appreciated the human agency part that the three speakers have really brought forward. Regardless that you were coming from different experiences, both professionally and personally, you were able to really tell us and demonstrate that we can only navigate through the recovery and also the construction of our new narrative only for emphasizing greatly on the capacity that we have as a society. I think it goes back to redefining what is really a civilization, what is society, what's the purpose of community. I'm always reminded that the 20th century was a significant period of our history in the way we grew, because we were very clear in what we were trying to achieve. We were trying to achieve, to some extent, democracy and free markets. We paid a really expensive price for that. We spent 7 decades of our time trying to preserve it and defend it. And we were quite clear that the leading intellectual heritage was the one of the West. But now I think no matter where you're coming from, the imperative tends to be shifting elsewhere. They shift elsewhere in terms of the way we measure the economic activities. They're shifting elsewhere in where we're looking at the environment as being much more than just an externality. And the question is, will politics, that in my humble opinion is a form of leadership, be able to realign the rhetoric to capture where the new imperative are really gone? And I guess, can we move away from this extremely wicked trade-off mentality in which we're thinking about that if we want to have economic opportunity, we have to degrade the environment, just to mention one of the most common trade-off that we're hearing. So successful leadership into the 21st century will really be about, going back to General Casey, mitigating and reconciling the VUCA world, which is not coming as a clear straight line, but is coming with a set of complexities that are normal given the interdependency we achieve as a society. So again, fascinating topics, really what we needed to wrap up our conversation after we went from the perspective of globalization to technologies into mainly the degree of agency that was already permeating a lot also in the previous speakers, but now you have been able really to create a context for us to understand the way forward. So thanks for this, for the three speakers, and Terence, up to you now.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. So thank you very much, Olaf. Thank you very much for our great speakers on the subject. To me, this is, from what I heard from the three of them, it's basically this is the time where we need to actually redefine how we actually approach leadership in many, many ways. We heard earlier on, how the world is actually changing. We heard earlier on how technologies are actually connecting each other. Human dynamics are very, very different right now. And not to mention, going forward, we have got much less clarity. We have got much less, much less a visibility as to where we can be going or where we are going. So like General Casey was saying, if your first plan, you should not actually expect your first plan to work. And the question then is, do we have the leadership skills? Do we have the strength? Do we have the courage? Do we have the resilience to actually keep on navigating, keep on pivoting in order to meet the future challenge? I very much hope that this is just a very, very beginning of of a conversation as to what form of functions, what form of skill sets we need to have in order to charge ahead and thrive in the new normal. Right, I'll pass it on to you, Dan.
Thanks, Terence. Thanks to all of you for sticking around. We're running a little over, but we'd love to get a couple questions in here. And Aaron, I'll open one that's come up that you would have some good insight on. Questions about what sorts of, you talked a little bit about, watching some of the larger trends you're seeing in government in terms of, maybe more controlled spending and trying to become more efficient and that sort of thing. Could you give us maybe some examples there? What sorts of trends are you seeing there in terms of where government is starting to look and how that might shift?
Well, I think you have this year, which will be challenging. I think you have to look at this year and then look at what comes after the November election, which will either be a dramatic shift if you have the election of a President Biden or a continuation with changes of a second term of a President Trump. I think that even if you see a second term of a Trump administration, the fiscal realities of the tax base, at least in the near term, are going to require adjustments. For this year, I think that there will be some adjustments. I mean, you've already seen, $3 trillion going out to deal with immediate needs for the coronavirus. Now that's largely been done, I'll call it off books. It was not done in any way that was offset by other government resources. So it was, not paid for. by revenue. So, you know, I have some insight into what's going on with the defense bill, which is going to hew fairly closely to the request from the president. We have not yet seen the full totality of the appropriations bills. I definitely think you will see increases in funding for health and human services and other needs for the coronavirus. Certainly out of the House of Representatives, I definitely think you will see funding adjustments that mirror the police reform bill that is moving forward in Congress, which is a policy bill, but I would expect you will see funding adjustments that are made in the appropriations process. And I expect it will be a late funding cycle, at least as late as you can be in an election year. But I think the more fundamental arguments are going to be had next year once you see how the presidential election and the balance of the House and the Senate are played out. There are certain arguments that have to be had this year just in terms of you know, some minor adjustments, but the fact that they did so much of the economic adjustments and coronavirus spending completely off book is, you know, kind of took that out of the appropriations realm. Obviously, there's still another coronavirus spending, whether you want to call it a bailout or economic stimulus, or you can argue what the appropriate language is depending on your, you know, economic point of view. But, you know, and certainly state and local governments that are arguing for the need to deal with their needs there. But, you know, I expect at least one more big bill that's off books before you get to normal appropriations. But, you know, that I think that's what will wrap this year up, but next year will be a whole nother ball of wax, I think.
Yeah,
I'm sorry for the sorry for the American colloquialisms there. I've been trying not to use American colloquialisms.
Well, November will bring maybe a little bit of clarity, but it might just keep things mixed up as well. Switching gears a little bit, General Casey and Helena, I'd love to get both of you to comment on this a little bit. You know, there's sort of a balance, I suppose, in being both realistic and acknowledging the challenges and the pain, but also, you know, being inspirational and pointing a future direction. I mean, especially in this environment. General Casey, I guess, what do you look for in terms of focusing on, whether it's with the current pain or the forward-looking opportunity in a time like this? And I guess, how do you get people to acknowledge where we are and then buy into where we can go?
Now we're talking. Sorry. That's why I say that the leaders who seem to be the most successful today are the ones who are envisioning the future and communicating that in a way that people can appreciate it and act on it. That's important. The second part of it that I think is also important is candor, and I mentioned that. People need to hear it straight, and then they need to see that the solution is not impossible. And that's where the motivational part comes in. And that I might say that doesn't come at first blush. I think people need a while to work on something before they start seeing the positive possibilities that can come out of it. So those would be the two things that I'd say. I think that candor is important. And then that articulation of where you ultimately see the organization going, so that people can see the way out of this crisis, that it's not always going to be terrible, that you envision a future that's different, but it's a good future for the organization.
Is there something in the current environment that that stood out to you in terms of, identifying with that candor and building from?
Well, I mean, I think, right at the beginning of this, the governor of Ohio, Mike DeWine, he was the first one to close schools. And he had a vision of the future, and he acted on it. And people in Ohio, I'm sure not everyone, but the majority of the people in Ohio respected that. And he had to make that decision knowing that it might not ultimately be right. But he acted on it. And just by, people need leaders to be willing to take a chance. And that action is also motivating. That it shows that the leader doesn't see the situation as hopeless, but by acting, he or she intends to lead the organization through it.
Helena, similarly, you were talking about talking to a number of people in preparing for this. I guess what were you hearing in terms of what are some of these current pain points, and how do you sort of internalize them and then figure out, okay, where do we go from here? What are the steps that we can take in Parliament and just as individual leaders as well?
Thank you for this question. I think I'm actually going to go a slightly different route than George Casey did. And I'm really glad for this question, because this was one of those things that I actually took out of my 5-minute lightning talk. As a leader, I believe one of the most important things to earn people's hearts is to acknowledge the bad. I don't think that we're really looking for that hero anymore. We're looking for someone who is real. And how do you show that you're genuine? Well, today we have all these different channels in doing that, in social media, and it's a lot easier to come much closer to your audience, so to speak, or your electorate. But I believe this process needs to go in certain steps. And step one is acknowledging the bad, what is happening right now, and saying that it is bad, as a matter of fact. And that's not good, but just acknowledging that, and then showing that you truly understand. And going from there, I believe that humility is one of the greatest keys to good leadership. And I'm really glad that George Casey brought that up in his lightning talk also. Because I think, like I said, I don't think we're looking for that hero anymore. I think we're looking for someone who is able to show who they are and portray themselves for real, not just the facade. And then, once you're there, once you've acknowledged the bad and been stable, but acknowledge the bad, then you're able to sort of look at where can we go from here together. And I really think that that is key. It's not just me. I can't do everything. Nobody can. And acknowledging that and showing those insecurities that you actually have can be a very valuable strength in being inspirational going forward.
That's great. I really appreciate that sort of shift in thinking from not looking for a hero, but looking for someone authentic, showing their true selves and helping collectively from there. Well, thank you, Helena, Aaron, and George. Thank you again for your time. And I want to thank all the panelists and speakers we've had on here today. Just my personal thanks for such great insight. And I'll kick it over to Mark to start closing things up.
Yes. So, I have this great honor to start with the gratitude that we have. So, Helena, you were talking about maybe not heroes, but somehow you all have been both heroes and authentic in your talks, because you really help the 100 people who decided to join us today for over 2.5 hours, almost 3, to really make cast light over the possibility we have to reshuffle what has happened as an opportunity for us for construction, not just reconstruction, but really construction almost from scratch. We sometimes need ground zeros to be able to really build stronger, better, more resilient. So really great from Nick, Lake, Amit in the globalization track, from Marty, Michael, Eleni, Aisha, and Chengyang in the technology track, and George, Erin, and Helena in the leadership track. You truly have led by example, and we're really thankful for the work you have done. So it's been phenomenal to actually not only to host you, but really learn from all of you. Terrence.
Thank you, Mark. We started by, with this, we started this summit by saying that we can remain hopeful. And after this conversation we had, I believe that, there is quite a bit of hope out there. As long as we are willing, we have the determination to do something. But so thank you very, very much from me to all the panelists here today. You took the time to actually come and share your wisdom with us. You took your time to come and to this a summit to share to spread your words, share your views with our audience. Of course, I would very, very much like to say also thank you to all the attendees today, to all the to our audience today. You guys actually put up with us for 3 hours now, almost it's a very, very long time, and you're still here with us. So we do very much hope that this summit is something of use to you. It is it's created some value for you. Olaf, go back to you.
Thank you, Mark and Terrence and Dan, my brothers in arms here. I appreciate the closing here. Let me just say a few words of thank you myself. But first of all, let me say that the future, the best way to predict the future is to build it, right? And all of you in the audience are the builders of the future. And we are here to facilitate that. We're here to help you build it. But we are here for you, especially those of you who are young leaders now stepping into leadership roles. Don't hesitate to call on us. We will be by your side. But the future can be good in the medium term. Let's make it happen, right? So thank you for hanging in with us. We know we're running over time here. Just a few words of gratitude to everybody else. The speakers, of course. We have monopolized your time. Your insights were invaluable. Thank you for the graciousness with which you've engaged with us and the audience. I also want to, of course, thank GoFundMe.org as our charity partner. We will be donating the net proceeds there. And then I also would like to thank our team, if you allow me. And of course, you see them all here on the screen. Somebody whom you haven't heard speak very much is the eminence not so grise, Tobias Straube, who is smiling at you right now, who has really been leading this production team. Many, many thanks to you, Tobias, for your leadership, and of course your team for getting this all squared away really well. And we couldn't have done it without you, and I think it went over really, really well. And I guess that leaves me to just say we will be continuing this, summarizing the conclusions, the tensions, the disruptions, the discontinuities, the shifts, as it were, in our podcast. We are planning a podcast here. We are also planning to post this video recording on YouTube, and you can ask questions there, and we might do a Q&A. And then I should also say that Mark, Terrence, and I, with Dan's help, are planning on writing a book about the great remobilization and really new grand designs for our societies and economies. And all of what we discussed here will be building material for that. So to that end, you have now helped us invest in the future as well, and hopefully bring some of that back to you for your enjoyment and for your leadership skills. So with that, let me bid you farewell and just ask Dan, please keep me honest. If I have forgotten to thank anybody, please do that on my behalf now.
I think you caught everyone. Thank you, Olaf. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Terrence, for your contributions. Thanks again to everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. Again, our best for your health and prosperity, both for this year and in the many years to come. Thank you.